Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. When I first started working at the missing persons hotline, I didn't expect the job to stay with me after I clocked out. But it didn't take long for the calls to settle into my bones like a damp chill you can't shake. The kind that lingers in the back of your mind when you're eating dinner or lying in bed, replaying the sound of someone's voice over and over again, wondering if you could have said something better or faster that might have made a difference. The room we worked in was small, square, and plain, tucked away on the second floor of a squat brick building downtown that looked more like an accountant's office than the last hope for families searching for loved ones. And my first impression was that it felt a little too ordinary for the kind of desperate, life-changing conversations that took place inside. We had 4 desks on each side of the room, each with an old rolling chair that squeaked if you leaned back too far. Computer screen glowing in that tired blue tone of outdated software. A headset hanging on the corner of every monitor, and laminated lists taped to the desk that outlined the steps for taking a call. Things like remain calm, get full name, last known location, ask if they have spoken to police, and most importantly, do not promise anything. They drilled that into us during training, the idea that we could be kind and patient and thorough, but we could never give someone the false hope that their missing husband or wife or child would definitely be found. 'Cause the truth is that sometimes they aren't, and sometimes they are, but not in the way the caller wants. On my first day, my supervisor, a woman named Karen with kind eyes but a voice that carried a constant edge of fatigue, told me that the work would be hard. Not because of the pace, most shifts were slow, but because of the weight of what we were dealing with. She said it in a way that made me think she had seen more than her share of calls that didn't end well. She sat me at my desk, adjusted my headset, and said, "You're going to hear things you wish you could unhear. The trick is learning to let the calls end when they end. If you carry them home, they'll chew at you." I nodded like I understood, but I didn't. Not really. Not until later. At first, my shifts were quiet. Almost too quiet, with long stretches of nothing but the soft clacking of keyboards and the occasional muffled voice from another operator. And I remember thinking, maybe this job wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would be one of those roles where you just log hours, follow the script, and go home. But then the calls started coming in. Not all the time, but enough to make the silence between them feel tense. My very first call was from an older woman whose son hadn't come home the night before. And the whole time she was talking, her voice trembled in a way that made me think of a frayed rope about to snap. I followed the script word for word, asking when she last saw him, what he was wearing, who his friends were, and I typed every detail into the system, my fingers moving faster the more her voice wavered. I told her the report would go to the local police, that they would be in touch soon, and she said thank you in a way that didn't sound grateful at all, just tired. When I hung up, I realized my hands were sweating, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. And I remember Karen glancing over from her desk and giving me a look that was part, "You did fine," and part, "You'll get used to it." The next few calls over the following days blurred together. A runaway teenager, a man who hadn't come home from work, a missing dog that we had to gently explain was outside our scope, and I started to see how easy it could be to let the words become routine, to file them away as just another call. But sometimes, certain details caught in my head and refused to leave. Like the way a mother's voice cracked when she described her daughter's laugh, or how a man kept repeating his wife's name, like he thought if he said it enough times, she might walk back through the door. I started to notice patterns too, how the first 30 seconds of a call told you almost everything you needed to know about the caller's state of mind, how some people rushed through the details like they were afraid of running out of time, while others spoke so slowly you could hear the disbelief in every pause. By my third week, I felt like I was finding a rhythm. It's a kind of steady breathing you get when you've been walking for a while and your body just falls into step, and I thought maybe I was getting the hang of it. I started to believe Karen when she said the key was leaving the calls at the desk, walking out of the building and letting them stay there. And maybe I could have, if it weren't for one night near the end of my first month, a night that began, like any other, with the quiet hum of the overhead lights and the occasional static in my headset, the muted tapping of my coworker Emily's nails on her keyboard across the room, smell of stale coffee from the pot that had been sitting in the corner since noon. It was almost the end of my shift, and I remember glancing at the clock and thinking about what I'd make for dinner when the line rang in my headset. The same soft chime as every other call. Nothing special about it, but the moment I answered, I noticed the silence on the other end wasn't the usual kind. It wasn't a hesitation or static. It was deliberate, like someone was there but taking their time to speak. And when the voice finally came through, deep and slow and strangely steady, it didn't sound like any call I'd taken before. And even though at the time I didn't know it yet, it was the beginning of the worst stretch of my life. The moment the job stopped being something I could clock out of and became something I'd carry with me everywhere, even into my dreams. If there's one thing they drill into you from the first hour of training at the missing persons hotline, it's that the rules aren't suggestions. They're lifelines, not just for the people calling in, but for the operators too, because without those rules, you drown in the chaos of every story, every sobbing voice, every half-formed sentence where the person on the other end is begging you for something you can't give. The rules are meant to keep you steady, to keep you from making promises that you can't keep. Because the truth is, most of the time, we don't know how these stories will end, And pretending we do is a cruelty all its own. And so we stick to the script. Step 1, remain calm, no matter what they say, no matter how urgent it feels or how close to panic they sound. Because if you start to mirror their fear, you'll both spiral and nothing gets done. Step 2, get the details in order. Name, age, description, last known location, time they were last seen, any habits or medical issues that could matter. And you do it slowly, clearly, because police will rely on the exact words you record. Step 3, ask if they have spoken to the police already, because we're not the first step in an investigation. We're a parallel line, a place where information filters in from those too panicked or too frustrated to wait at a station counter. Step 4, record every single word they say exactly as they say it. No rephrasing, no fixing their grammar. Because sometimes the way something is said is just as important as what is said. Step 5, if there is any sign of immediate danger or threat to life, patch the call through to the local law enforcement liaison who sits in the office 2 doors down. In step 6, the one they emphasized over and over like a mantra, do not promise anything ever. Not that we'll find them, not that they're safe, not that we'll call back with news, because the moment you make a promise, you can't keep it. You've crossed a line that will haunt you. I learned early on that these rules are there not just for order, but as a wall between you and the people on the other end of the line, because that wall is the only thing stopping the emotions from pouring in so heavy you can't breathe. Karen told me a story once, late on a slow night, about an operator who had worked there before me. A man named Ray who broke that last rule when he told a father he was sure they'd find his daughter before the end of the week. They didn't. Not alive anyway. And Ray never came back to work after that. Just stopped showing up. And no one knew if it was guilt or grief or both. But it was enough to keep the rest of us in line. I told myself I'd never be that person, that no matter how much I wanted to reassure someone, I'd keep the barrier up, keep my words controlled. And for the first few weeks, it worked. Even when the calls shook me, I kept the mask on. My voice even and steady. My notes precise. My promises non-existent. But that night, near the end of my first month, the one where the line opened to that strange, measured silence before the caller spoke, I felt the first cracks forming in that wall, because the man's voice didn't sound like someone in shock, or grief, or confusion. It sounded like someone who had been rehearsing, like someone who was telling me something for a reason, and that reason wasn't to get help. "I want to report a missing person," he said, and it wasn't the words themselves that got to me. We heard that every day. It was the tone, calm and deliberate, like he was reading from a script he'd written himself. And when I asked for the name, he said, "Claire Matthews," without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask. I followed the rules, just like they trained me. I asked for her age, 34, her height, 5'6", her hair, dark brown, shoulder length, the clothes she was wearing last time she was seen, jeans and a green sweater. And as he spoke, there was no quiver in his voice, no hesitation to search for the right words. It all came out smooth, too smooth, like a story told from memory instead of one unfolding in real time. When I asked when she went missing, he said, "She will go missing tonight." And I froze just enough that I almost didn't catch the next part, around 11:15. And for a moment, I thought he'd misspoken, that he meant she went missing last night, so I repeated it back for confirmation, and he said, "No, you heard me." And then he began telling me details about what she'd be doing before she disappeared. She'd be walking home from her sister's place. She'd take the long route along Oak Street instead of cutting through the park. She'd be carrying a paper bag with leftover dinner. She'd be humming a song she always hummed when she was alone. And none of this fit with the training, because the rules assumed the person on the other end was reporting something that had already happened, not something that hadn't happened yet. I kept my voice steady, or tried to, writing everything down exactly as he said it, because I didn't know what else to do. And when I asked how he knew this would happen, he said, "Because I'll be the one who makes it happen," in that same calm, measured tone, and every hair on my arms stood up. I did what the rules said. I flagged the call as an immediate threat and signaled to Karen with the hand gesture we used for urgent police involvement. And she began patching in the liaison while I tried to keep the man talking, asking where he was, if Claire knew him, if she was in danger right now. But the moment Karen started the patch, the line went dead, just a soft click, like he'd decided he'd said enough. The liaison officer took the recording and promised to get it to the right department, and Karen told me not to dwell on it. That these kinds of calls happened sometimes, people making sick jokes or trying to rattle operators, but something about his voice told me it wasn't a joke. And when I left that night, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, wondering if maybe the rules worked fine when you were dealing with grief or confusion, but maybe they weren't built for a voice like his, a voice that didn't just want to be heard, it wanted to be remembered. I kept telling myself to file it away like any other odd call, to let it become just another story that slipped into the stack of strange, sad, or unsettling reports that passed through the hotline every week. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way his voice had wrapped itself around those details, the way each word seemed to sit exactly where he wanted it. No wasted breath, no stumbles, no panic, as if the whole thing had already happened, and he was replaying it from memory instead of telling me something that hadn't yet occurred. And I remember sitting at my desk the next morning, staring at the log I'd typed into the system, reading the words "she will go missing tonight" over and over, wondering why I hadn't pushed harder for him to explain how he knew. Oh, deep down, I already knew the answer, because something in the way he spoke told me I wasn't going to get answers he didn't want to give. And because the rules said I wasn't supposed to interrogate, just to gather and pass along the information. Still, I couldn't shake it, and as I put my headset on and settled into my chair that day. Every ring of the phone made me flinch a little, like I was half expecting his voice to come back through the line, calm and unhurried, ready to tell me what else he had planned. The day moved in slow stretches, the kind of hours that feel heavy, where time pools in the corners of the room and you notice every creak of the floor or shuffle of paper. And when calls did come in, they were ordinary enough to almost lull me back into routine. A missing college roommate who turned up an hour later, father looking for his runaway son, a confused caller who thought we were a different hotline entirely. But under it all was the memory of that voice running on a loop in my mind. I told myself maybe it really had been a hoax, some creep who got a kick out of scaring people, and maybe nothing would happen at all. But as the hours passed, I found myself glancing at the clock more often, calculating the time left until the moment he'd predicted Claire Matthews would vanish. I stayed late that night, something I didn't usually do. It's finishing reports I could have left for the next shift, and I told Karen it was because I wanted to make sure everything from the previous night's call was in perfect order for the police. But the truth was, I didn't want to be at home when 11:15 rolled around. I wanted to be here, surrounded by light and the quiet murmur of the other operators, where it felt like maybe the world couldn't quite reach me. Still, when the clock finally hit the time he'd said, my stomach twisted in a way that made it hard to breathe, and though the phone didn't ring and nothing seemed to change, Kai had the sense that somewhere out there, the thing he'd promised was unfolding. Kai, and I hated that I couldn't do anything about it. The next morning, I checked the local police bulletins as soon as I sat down, scrolling through updates with a kind of urgency I couldn't explain, and there was nothing, no new reports, no urgent alerts, nothing that matched the name or description he'd given, and I almost let myself relax until about 2 days later, when the first hint of it showed up in the system. Not as a direct call to us, but as an update from a police department in the next county over. A missing woman, last seen leaving her sister's house late at night, wearing jeans and a green sweater, carrying a paper bag. Her name was Claire Matthews. I remember staring at the report so long my eyes burned, my mind replaying the call word for word. Okay, every single detail matching exactly what he'd said. And for the first time in my short time at the hotline, I felt truly cold in my own skin, like something had reached through the phone and left a fingerprint on me. I went to Karen's desk with the police report pulled up and watched her face shift as she read it. Not shock exactly, but something heavier, the look of someone who didn't want to admit what it meant. She told me we needed to pass the connection along to the detectives who'd taken the original call, and that she'd handle it, but the way she avoided my eyes told me she was just as unsettled as I was. The rest of that day passed in a haze, every normal call sounding distant. My voice on autopilot as my mind kept circling back to one question. How could he have known unless he was the one who did it? And if he was, why call me at all? Why tell me in advance, unless the point wasn't to be stopped, but to be heard, to make sure someone knew he was out there? That night, when I got home, I didn't bother turning on the TV or making dinner right away. I just sat on my couch in the dim light of the living room and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator, thinking about what it meant if this was real, if he really was telling me the future. And I realized something that made my skin prickle. If the first call had been exactly right, then it meant he wasn't going to stop at one, and it meant the next time the phone rang, I might be hearing about another life already ticking down to its end. After the Claire Matthews case showed up in the police bulletin, I started looking at every new report differently. And it wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a kind of quiet dread that sat under my ribs like a weight, because I realized that if the caller was telling the truth about her, then anything he said next might be another countdown I couldn't stop. And so every morning when I came into the office, before I even took my first call, I'd pull up the active case list in the system and scan it for names, descriptions, or locations that might connect to what I'd heard. Even though part of me knew I was probably just torturing myself, it became a habit, this routine check that was supposed to be a formality, something all operators did once in a while to stay familiar with recent cases. But for me, it turned into something more, a ritual, a way to try and see the ripples from his calls before they turned into headlines. And at first, it was always nothing, just the usual scatter of reports. A missing hiker, a teenager who left home after an argument, someone's elderly father who hadn't returned from a morning walk, cases that sometimes resolved before I even finished my shift. Still, I couldn't stop scanning, and the more I looked, the more I noticed how most cases had at least a few threads you could pull on a friend who saw them last, a place they were known to visit, a fight, a pattern. But Claire's case had nothing like that. No connections, no hints. Just a woman walking home and vanishing like she'd stepped into a gap in the world. It bothered me, the clean emptiness of it. The same way the caller's voice had been clean of hesitation. And it was that feeling that made me dig deeper than I probably should have, looking through the internal police database for any report involving a green sweater or Oak Street in the past year. Anything that might make me think this was part of a larger pattern. But all I found were scattered, unrelated incidents, and I told myself to let it go. Karen noticed what I was doing and told me not to get stuck on one case, reminding me that we were there to take calls, not solve them, and that our job ended the moment we hit submit on a report. After that, it was in the hands of the investigators. I nodded and pretended to agree, but inside, I knew I wouldn't be able to just let it go. 'Cause the thing about hearing someone describe a disappearance before it happens is that it changes the way you hear every other call. Like a shadow over the conversation, a quiet voice in the back of your head asking, what if this one hasn't happened yet either? About a week after Claire's case went into the system, I was doing my usual morning scan when something caught my eye, not because it was connected to the caller, but because it was so strangely empty. A follow-up note from the police liaison about the previous week's reports and under Claire's file. There was no update, no sign of progress, not even a mention of possible leads. I'd seen cases stall before, but usually there was at least some scrap of information, a witness statement or a location check, but hers was blank, like the whole thing had been swallowed by silence. It left me with an itch between my shoulder blades, the kind that makes you want to turn around and check if someone's there. And that day, I found myself watching the door every time it opened, half expecting to see a detective walk in with questions, but no one did. By the end of the week, I started to think maybe the caller had gone quiet for good, that maybe this was a one-time thing, and I was almost convincing myself of that when it happened. Another call. It's the same deep, measured voice cutting through. The low hum of the office, like a knife through cloth. I froze for just half a second before answering, trying to keep my tone steady. Okay. As soon as I said my greeting, he spoke, not rushing, not stumbling, like he'd been waiting for me to. Pick up. And he said, Melissa Green. Just a name at first, like he wanted me to write it down before he went further. I followed the script, asking the same questions as before: age, description, last known location, and he answered each one without pause, telling me she was 28, with blonde hair pulled back in a braid, wearing a white coat and black boots. And then, just like with Claire, he said she hadn't gone missing yet, that it would happen in 3 days, in the early evening. Right after she left her shift at the diner where she worked, I felt my hand tighten on the pen as I wrote it down, and I could hear Karen's chair creak as she turned toward me, picking up on the tension in my voice. I asked the caller how he knew this, and he said, because I can see her now, in a tone so casual it made my skin crawl, like he was commenting on the weather. I signaled to Karen again, The quiet gesture that meant patch this through to the liaison. But just like before, as soon as the patch started, the line went dead. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the blank call-ended notification on my screen, feeling that same cold weight settled over me. 'Cause now I knew it wasn't a one-off, it was a pattern. And that meant Melissa's name was already written into a story that would end the same way as Claire's. The rest of that shift, I went through the motions of my job, my voice steady, my notes precise, but every time the phone rang, I hoped it would be her calling in, telling me she'd heard someone was after her, giving me the chance to warn her, but it never was. And when I went home that night, the rules of the job felt less like a wall protecting me and more like a chain keeping me from saying the one thing I wanted to say, that I believed him, hey, and that she needed to get out before the clock ran out. I sat at my desk the next morning with a cup of stale coffee that tasted like it had been brewed the night before. My hands wrapped so tightly around the paper cup that the cardboard was starting to go soft from the heat, and I kept replaying the words from last night over and over in my head, like a bad song I couldn't stop hearing. Its details about the alley, the victim's clothes, the way the caller said it, like they were already standing there watching it happen, except it hadn't happened yet, not according to any police report I could find, 'cause I had checked the local news websites, scrolled every alert on my phone, even looked at the smaller community crime boards, and there was nothing. Just the usual reports of break-ins, a few domestic disturbances, and the occasional missing pet. But nothing about a woman found in an alley, and it was driving me crazy, because I knew in my gut that the man on the phone wasn't making it up. And I hated how that felt, like I was already 2 steps behind something I couldn't see. As the day dragged on, the other operators came in, their chatter filling the room as they logged into their stations. Some complaining about the heat in the building or the smell coming from the fridge in the break room, and I kept my head down, not wanting to draw attention to myself, because what was I supposed to say? Hey, someone called last night to describe a murder that hasn't happened yet, so I'm just waiting for it to happen. That would make me sound paranoid at best, unstable at worst. And in this job, you learned quickly to balance empathy with skepticism, because too many calls were just drunks, pranksters, or lonely people who wanted to hear another voice for a while. But the man from last night hadn't sounded like any of those, and that was the problem. I told myself maybe it would fade from my mind. Maybe if I just focused on other calls, I could push it away. But the universe seemed to have a sick sense of humor, because around noon, when the lunch rush in the office meant half the desks were empty and the phones were still ringing nonstop, my headset clicked to a new line, and I heard that same voice, calm, caved, and with that strange echo, like he was speaking from inside a room with bare walls. And he said, "It's almost time." And before I could even respond, before I could tell him to stop or ask who he was, the line went dead again, just like last time, leaving me staring at my computer screen while my pulse hammered in my ears. I don't know how long I sat there frozen before my supervisor, Carla, tapped my shoulder and asked if I was okay. And I lied, saying it was just a wrong number, but she narrowed her eyes like she could sense I wasn't telling the full truth, though, thankfully, she didn't push it. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my calls blending together into a haze of missing pet reports, welfare checks, and a teenage runaway whose mom sounded more angry than worried, but my mind kept drifting back to that second call, and the fact that he'd said almost time made it feel like I was counting down to something I couldn't stop. That night, after my shift, I walked home instead of taking the bus, even though it was almost an hour on foot, because I needed air. I needed to move. But every set of footsteps behind me made me glance over my shoulder, every shadow between. The streetlights looked like it might be hiding someone, and when I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door, then locked it again, and pulled the blinds tight. I couldn't shake the idea that he knew where I lived. I mean, If he knew details about a murder that hadn't happened yet, what else could he know? The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. A woman found in an alley on the east side, beaten and strangled, her clothes matching exactly what the caller had described: a red skirt, a white blouse, and black heels. The photo of the crime scene was grainy, shot from behind the police tape, but I could see the red fabric against the dark asphalt, and my stomach dropped so fast it felt like I'd swallowed a stone. I couldn't even pretend this was a coincidence anymore, not with how exact the details were, and the knowledge that the man had called me first made me feel complicit somehow, like I'd been given a warning and done nothing with it, and now someone was dead. At work, the office was buzzing. Not everyone had heard about the murder yet, okay? But the ones who had were whispering about it, swapping rumors about gangs or jealous lovers, and I sat there listening, my headset resting around my neck, my fingers numb against the keyboard, because I knew none of those guesses were right. For hours, I debated whether to go to the police, whether to tell them about the call, but every time I imagined walking into the station and explaining it, I could already hear the questions. Why didn't you report it sooner? How do we know? You're not making this up. What proof do you have? And the truth was, I didn't have proof. The call logs would show an incoming number, but the caller ID had been blocked, and even if they traced it, it could have been from a payphone or a burner cell. The only evidence was my word, and that didn't feel like enough, not when it came to something this insane. But that night, as I was sitting on my couch with the TV on low, pretending to watch a sitcom while my mind replayed the crime scene. The phone rang again. Not my work headset this time, but my personal cell. And when I saw the number, it was blocked, and every muscle in my body tensed as I answered. His voice was the same, low and unhurried, and he said, "You didn't try to stop it." I couldn't breathe for a second, couldn't even form words, and he continued, "Don't worry, you'll have another chance." Then the line went dead, leaving me staring at my reflection in the black screen of my phone, my own wide eyes, looking back at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in my apartment with the lights on, my phone in my lap, waiting for something to happen, because now I knew the truth. He wasn't done, and for some reason, he wanted me to know what was coming. I didn't go into work the next day with any sense of normalcy, even though I tried to pretend I did. The usual rhythm of the hotline phones ringing, papers shuffling, the low hum of the computers felt different now, as if everyone in the room was quietly aware of something dark moving beneath the surface, something that didn't belong but had forced itself into our reality. And while most of my coworkers seemed caught up in their own casseloads, I noticed the way some of them glanced at me, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, as if word had gotten around that I had taken a call the night before that wasn't just unusual, but disturbing in a way most hotline operators never experience, and I wondered how much of what I knew they actually knew. I kept my head down, answering calls, logging details, but my mind kept drifting back to that voice comm, almost conversational. It threaded with a kind of quiet, thrilled, telling me about a murder that hadn't happened yet. It's giving me details about a location, the victim's clothing, even the weapon. And every time I replayed it in my head, I found myself asking the same questions over and over. How could anyone know something like that unless they were planning it? And if they were planning it, why call me instead of just doing it in silence? There was no logical reason, except maybe they wanted me to know. Maybe they wanted someone to be aware of it before it happened. It's not to stop it, but to savor the idea that they'd told someone in advance, and that person couldn't prevent it. That's the kind of thing that stuck with me, because it was the kind of cruelty that wasn't about the act itself, but about making someone else carry the weight of knowing. And I hated how it worked, because now I was carrying it, alone and No matter how much I tried to shove it into the back of my mind, it kept slipping forward. Around midday, I took a break and went into the staff kitchen, thinking I'd grab a coffee just to clear my head. But when I walked in, there was a newspaper left on the counter, folded open to the local crime section, and my eyes immediately locked on a short article halfway down the page. Police investigating discovery of missing woman's purse near Riverside. The key read, and my chest tightened, not because it was directly connected to the call, but because the location was dangerously close to where the man had said the future murder would take place. I knew that cases near the river weren't uncommon. People went missing. Accidents happen, but the coincidence was too close for comfort, and I found myself reading the article over and over until the words blurred. The woman's name was Jessica Moore, last seen leaving a late shift at a diner. No sign of foul play, according to police, but her family was begging for help. I set the paper down, telling myself it might not be related, but that creeping feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Back at my desk, I kept glancing at the phone, half hoping and half dreading it would ring with that voice again. And when it finally did, hours later, I froze for a moment before answering. Missing persons hotline. "This is Mark," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "Okay." And there was silence for a beat long enough to make me think it was a wrong number before I heard that same slow, deliberate breathing on the other end, followed by the voice, soft and almost friendly. "You're watching the wrong people." I felt my grip tighten on the receiver, my other hand already reaching for the call log to jot something down. "Who is this?" I asked, but instead of answering directly, it continued as if I hadn't spoken. "You're going to get a call in a few days about someone who vanished near the bridge. You'll recognize her face, but not from here. Don't bother calling. The police, they won't get there in time." My pulse was pounding now, but I forced myself to keep my voice calm. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, and for the first time, there was the faintest chuckle on the other end. The kind that didn't sound like joy, but like someone savoring an inside joke. "'Cause you'll understand later," he said, and then the line went dead. Sat there for a moment, phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what had just happened, when I realized my hand was shaking so badly I could barely write. I immediately pulled up the call records to see if I could get a trace started, but like last time, the system showed it as untraceable no-caller ID. No originating number, nothing but a blank entry with a timestamp. My supervisor noticed me staring at the screen and walked over, asking if something was wrong, and I hesitated, knowing that reporting it again without evidence would sound paranoid, but I ended up telling him about the call anyway. He frowned, clearly concerned, but said what I already knew, without a number or recording. There was nothing we could do except make a note in the system and wait. That word, wait, felt heavier than it should have, because it wasn't passive anymore. It was a countdown, a ticking clock I could hear in the back of my mind every time the phone rang. Over the next 2 days, I couldn't stop scanning the missing persons database during my downtime, looking for any new cases near the river or the bridge, and when one finally popped up, my stomach dropped. Her name was Melissa Harper, years old, reported missing by her roommate after she didn't come home from a late-night jog along the Riverside Trail. The photo attached to her profile made my skin crawl not because I recognized her from the hotline or from any other case, but because she had been a regular at the cafe I went to almost every morning. I'd seen her enough times to remember her laugh, the way she always ordered a black coffee with too much sugar, and now she was gone. I printed the case file and stared at it, feeling this cold certainty that the man who had called me knew her fate before it happened, that he might even be the one responsible. And yet, here I was, sitting in an office with a headset on, unable to do anything but wait for him to call again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in my apartment, every car passing outside, sounded like it could be him. Not physically there, but present in a way I couldn't shake. like he'd planted something in my head that was growing whether I wanted it to or not. And when I finally did drift off, I dreamed about the river, not the real one, but a version where the water was pitch black and the banks were littered with belongings, shoes, purses, jackets, each one belonging to someone whose face I couldn't quite make out. I woke up sweating, my heart hammering, and I knew that the next time he called, I needed to do more than just log it. I needed to find a way to keep him talking, to pull anything out of him that could lead to an actual lead, 'cause if I didn't, the next prediction he made would end up coming true. And I wasn't sure I could keep carrying that weight without breaking. By the time I walked into the call center the next morning, the air felt heavier than it had in weeks, almost like the stale stillness before a storm. And I knew before I even clocked in that last night's incident wasn't going to just fade away. I could see it in the way people were moving around the room, slower, quieter, eyes darting up toward me as if I was carrying something they couldn't quite name but wanted to avoid. And it wasn't paranoia. There was a tension there that hadn't existed before. The kind that builds when everyone knows something strange is unfolding, but no one wants to be the one to say it out loud. The bulletin board by the coffee station had been updated, and right in the center was a new flyer with the words missing in big red letters. Another young woman. This one named Haley Turner, 25 years old, last seen leaving a late shift at a diner in Pine Hollow, about 40 minutes from our town. Her face smiling in the photo, but somehow haunted now that I knew the context. Pulled my eyes in like it was daring me to look away. The thing was, I didn't need to read the details. I had heard about her already, not from the news, not from the police, but from him, the caller, 2 nights ago. He'd described her in a way that matched the flyer exactly: the dark hair, pulled into a messy bun, the diner uniform, the tired smile she gave customers right before leaving work. And the worst part, he had told me where her body would be found, in that calm, eerie tone of his, as if reading from a script that had already been written. I grabbed a coffee and sat down at my desk, trying to convince myself not to make the connection, not to spiral into thinking this was all real. But then I overheard 2 of the supervisors whispering near the printer about how close the timeline was, and the girl matching exactly what was described. And my stomach dropped because it meant they had put it together too. No one wanted to say it outright, but it was there. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Around mid-morning, I got called into Paul's office. He was one of the higher-ups, usually the guy you only talk to about scheduling or serious policy stuff, and he closed the door behind me, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed, like he was bracing himself for bad news. T asked me to walk him through every detail of the call from 2 nights ago, from the moment the phone rang to the exact words the man had said. I tried to keep my voice steady, but as I repeated his phrases, she'd be found near water. It looked like she ran away, but she didn't. I could hear how crazy it sounded coming from my mouth. Still, Paul didn't laugh or look skeptical. He just stared at me with this strange expression, part concern, part fear, maybe. He asked if I thought the caller might be involved in Haley's disappearance, and before I could even answer, I realized the real question wasn't if he was involved. It was how he knew what was going to happen before it did. Paul said they had already reported the call to law enforcement, which made sense. But then he lowered his voice and told me the cops had been non-committal about it, probably because it was all technically hearsay. Right? They didn't have the actual recording. Yet, apparently, our system had some kind of technical glitch during that exact time window, and the audio file came up corrupted. No backup, no proof, just my word against silence. My skin prickled at that. How convenient that the only call in months with that kind of detail just happened to be the one that didn't save. I left his office with my head buzzing, every step back to my desk feeling heavier. The rest of the shift blurred together, though I kept catching myself glancing at the phone like it was a living thing, waiting for it to ring with that same number. When it finally did, it was almost closing time, and my heart stopped for a second because the caller ID matched the one from before. My hand shook when I picked up, and before I could even say the hotline greeting, his voice came through steady, slow, and chillingly familiar. He said, "You've been thinking about me? That's good. You should." I froze, not sure if I should try to keep him talking or hang up and alert Paul. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Haley wasn't the first. She won't be the last. You should keep an eye on the board. It'll help. You keep up the board, the missing persons board by the coffee station." I asked him why he was telling me this, what he wanted, but he just gave this low chuckle like a sound he'd been holding back until now. I said, "Because it's nice to have someone watching who understands." Then the line went dead. I sat there gripping the receiver, like if I let go, I'd lose my only tether to understanding what was happening. And it was only when Paul appeared at my side, asking if that was him, that I realized my breathing had gone shallow. We tried to pull up the recording again, and just like before, the file was corrupted. I could see the timestamp proof the call existed, but the audio was just static. Paul's face went pale when he saw it, and I could tell he didn't know if this was some technical issue or something else entirely. By the time I left for the night, the rain had started. The kind of thin drizzle that makes the streets shine under the streetlights. And as I walked to my car, I had this sudden, overwhelming sense that I was being watched, not in the vague, paranoid way, in the very real, every instinct in my body screaming at me kind of way. I turned once, saw no one, but the feeling didn't go away. Driving home, my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights that never passed me. When I finally got to my apartment and locked the door behind me, I stood in the dark living room for a long time, listening, not for footsteps or voices, but for the silence between them, the same silence that had filled the line before he spoke. And in that silence, I realized something. He wasn't just calling to brag or scare me. He was calling to make sure I was part of it, whatever it was. And the worst part, it was working. After the second call, I realized that I couldn't treat these incidents like isolated events anymore. Not when the details matched perfectly with what ended up happening. And every day at work became a careful exercise in observation and calculation, scanning the call logs, the police bulletins, and even social media for anything that could indicate a pattern or a warning, 'cause I knew the man wasn't just calling randomly. He was deliberate, calculated, and most importantly, he wanted me to see the sequence before it unfolded, and that thought alone made my stomach turn into a knot that I couldn't untangle. For the next few weeks, I developed a routine that I hoped would make me feel like I was in control, even though I wasn't. Arriving early to check the case updates, reviewing every detail of new reports, noting times, locations, and descriptions in my notebook in the small margins of my shift schedule, as if writing it all down could somehow contain the chaos. And I began to see a pattern emerge. Every call came before the disappearance, sometimes by hours, sometimes by a day or two. And each time the details were precise, almost surgical in their specificity, from the victim's clothing and hair color to the exact time they were last seen and the route they would take. And though my rational mind kept saying it was impossible, my gut told me otherwise, that this was real, that there really was someone on the other end of the line orchestrating these events and letting me know in advance. And that made every new call feel like both a warning and a trap. I started keeping a detailed chart, mapping the sequence of his calls against the reports of missing persons, using colored pens and sticky notes trying to see if the locations formed a pattern. And when I finally connected the dots, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. The places he described weren't random. They formed a rough path through the outskirts of town, the river, the industrial park, and the small residential areas, almost like a twisted map. And the timing between each disappearance followed a rhythm, a cadence that made me feel like I could almost predict when the next call would come if I paid attention. And then it happened. Again, the phone rang just as the clock hit 7 in the morning. It's cool, a number I had come to recognize immediately as blocked. And when I picked it up, the calm, deliberate voice was there. Soft, almost casual, saying, "You've been keeping track. Good. It's time to see the pattern more clearly, okay?" And I felt my stomach knot, because it wasn't just information anymore. It was a lesson, okay? And I was the student in a class I didn't want to attend. I tried to ask questions, tried to get him to reveal something, anything I could use to prevent another disappearance, but he was evasive, answering in riddles and metaphors, dropping tiny hints about the next location without ever saying it outright, forcing me to connect the dots on my own. And it was terrifying because every guess I made, every inference felt like it carried weight. Like if I got it wrong, someone could die. And yet he wouldn't confirm or deny, just kept the game going. Measured and disturbingly patient. After that call, I spent hours at my desk, going through every report, every missing person alert, every call log we had from the past year, trying to see if there were any other instances I had missed. And it was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, because with each new piece of data I collected, the more I realized just how meticulous he was, how he had thought through every detail, and how impossible it would be to stop him without law enforcement being fully engaged. And the frustrating truth was that despite my insistence, the police didn't take my warnings seriously at first. It's probably because I didn't have recordings, just my notes, and because it sounded impossible, someone knowing about these disappearances before they happened. But after the third or fourth call, when another young woman went missing exactly as he had described, the investigators started to pay attention, and I was pulled into meetings where I had to explain the situation. My face pale and my hands shaking as I laid out the timeline, the calls, the notes, the maps, and the patterns. And it was surreal to watch grown detectives with years of experience stare at my charts and whisper to one another, some in disbelief, others with a kind of grim understanding that made my stomach twist. I remember one officer, a woman named Detective Harris, who leaned in close and asked me if I was certain about the times, the details, everything, and I nodded, even though the memories of his voice, calm and deliberate, still played over in my head like a recording that I couldn't turn off. And she sighed, saying that if what I was saying was true, we were dealing with someone extremely organized, intelligent, and dangerous, someone who had studied how missing persons' cases worked, how the police responded, how to manipulate the system so he could control the narrative while keeping just enough distance to avoid immediate detection. And at that moment, I realized that the man wasn't just a random predator. He was methodical, almost clinical, treating the world like a chessboard, and me like a pawn he could use to watch his moves unfold. After the meeting, I returned to my desk, heart pounding, mind racing, and stared at the phone for what felt like hours, half expecting it to ring again. And when it finally did, I froze, my grip tightening on the receiver, because I already knew it was him. And it was. And when I said hello, he didn't give me the usual details at first. Instead, he asked if I'd been following the pattern, And when I hesitated, he chuckled softly, the sound low and almost indulgent, saying, "Good, you're learning. Keep watching, keep noting, and maybe you'll help me see it through." And I felt a cold shiver run through me, because he wasn't just calling to inform me anymore. He was instructing me, guiding me through a process I didn't want to be part of, but couldn't escape. And then he began giving subtle hints about the next disappearance, speaking in code, dropping phrases that I had to interpret, writing notes in my notebook like I was decoding some kind of dark puzzle. And I realized with a sinking feeling that I was now an unwilling participant in his plan, watching and recording, knowing, but powerless to act decisively because the law enforcement response was too slow. And I was still just a hotline operator, not a detective, not armed with resources, not capable of stopping him on my own. After that call, I spent the rest of my shift in a kind of trance, logging every call that came in but barely listening, my mind replaying the hints, the patterns, the chilling calm of his voice, and I kept thinking about Claire Matthews, about Melissa Green, about Haley Turner, about every name he had predicted, every detail that had come true. And the horrifying thought struck me. I had no idea how many times this had happened before I started working here. How many people had vanished after a call like his, silently, unseen, unrecorded, unnoticed. And the realization made my chest tighten so badly, I felt like I couldn't breathe. When I finally left the building, the sky was gray, clouds hanging low and heavy, rain starting to fall, and as I walked to my car, every footstep felt like it was echoing in a tunnel. Every shadow under the streetlights seemed to shift, and I realized I wasn't just afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of what I might see if I didn't keep careful track. What would happen if I missed a single detail, a single hint, a single call? Because the moment I faltered, the next disappearance might be someone I knew, someone I'd crossed paths with, and that thought was more terrifying than any ghost or shadow. I drove home slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror, and when I locked the door behind me, I sat in my apartment in the dark. The phone on the table in front of me, the notebook open with all my scribbled maps and notes, and I realized that this wasn't just a job anymore, not a hotline shift, not a sequence of calls to log and pass along. It was a living nightmare. One I couldn't wake up from, one I couldn't escape, and one I didn't know if I would survive intact. Because the pattern was only becoming clearer, the clock was ticking, and the man on the phone wasn't done. After the latest call, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the next disappearance to happen, because it wasn't just about keeping notes anymore. It was about trying to predict him, to anticipate his moves, even though every instinct screamed that I had no real control. And that's what made every decision feel like walking a tightrope over an endless abyss. Knowing that one wrong step could result in another life lost, and I spent the next several days devising a system, a way to organize the information he had given me, the calls, the details, the subtle hints dropped in his casual, chilling tone, arranging everything into a giant chart on the wall of my apartment. Sticky notes in multiple colors, lines connecting locations, times, victims, and any patterns I could detect, because if I didn't, I felt like I was letting him win. And that idea that he could manipulate events from behind the phone, make me complicit without even touching anyone, terrified me more than anything. I started taking screenshots of the local news, logging every missing persons report, every police alert, comparing them with the calls, and as I did, the picture began to emerge, a pattern of control, almost a rhythm, where he would strike at a certain distance from the previous location, always leaving enough time for a call to reach me before the disappearance was noticed. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that he was toying with me, testing my ability to interpret the clues, to anticipate, to follow the breadcrumbs, without stepping out of line. And I hated how it worked, how effective it was, 'cause I was following the trail like a moth to a flame, knowing that each correct deduction only cemented my role in his twisted game. One afternoon, as I was staring at the board, trying to make sense of the timing between the last 3 victims, the phone rang, the line immediately sending a chill down my spine, and when I answered, I didn't need to ask who it was. His voice was unmistakable, calm, almost conversational, like he was talking to an old friend instead of someone who was frantically piecing together the evidence of his crimes. "You've been busy," he said, and I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me, because he wasn't judging, not really, just acknowledging that I was following the pattern, and in a way that made me feel sick, like I had already been pulled into his world and there was no way out, no pause button, nothing I could do but play along. And he continued, dropping hints about the next location, describing a corner of the city I knew well, a park near a busy intersection where people often walk their dogs in the early evening. And as he spoke, I frantically jotted notes, heart pounding, realizing that the details were already starting to come together for me, the pattern unfolding like some grotesque blueprint. And I had to figure out how to use it without anyone knowing what I was doing, because if the police knew how much he had involved me in predicting his moves, they might think I was part of it, or worse, incapable of providing credible information. After that call, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. My mind consumed with the map, the park, the potential victim, the time, the method. And by the end of my shift, I was physically exhausted, my hands cramped from scribbling, my eyes strained from staring at the wall full of notes. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about it, because I knew that waiting wasn't an option. And that's when I made the first real decision to take action. I was going to stake out the location he had hinted at least from a distance, to see if I could notice anything suspicious, anything that might prevent the next crime, even if I couldn't stop it completely. I didn't tell anyone at work, because I didn't trust that anyone would understand the subtlety of the clues, and even if they did, I didn't want them putting themselves in danger. So I prepared alone, packing a backpack with a notebook, my phone, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee, dressed in dark clothes, driving through the city with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, all the while replaying his voice, imagining his calm chuckle as if he knew I was following the instructions he had planted like pieces in a game of chess. When I arrived near the park just before sunset, the streets were quiet, and the dim light cast long shadows over the benches and playground equipment, the kind of light that makes everything look just a little sharper, a little more sinister. And I parked a few blocks away, trying to stay out of sight while keeping the area in my view, scanning the streets, the paths, the entrances, searching for anyone who might look out of place, any figure that could be his next target, or him lurking nearby. And I realized I hadn't felt fear this sharp before, the kind that tightens your chest, quickens your pulse, and makes your hands tremble uncontrollably, because the stakes were so tangible, so real. And I knew that any misstep could be catastrophic. Hours passed in a blur, dark slowly swallowing the day, my eyes never leaving the park, until finally movement caught my attention. A young woman, exactly the description he had hinted at, walking toward the far corner of the park where a street lamp flickered weakly, her hair tied back, a jacket thrown over her shoulders, unaware of the danger she might be walking into. And I wanted to call the police immediately, but I hesitated because I wasn't sure how to explain that the reason I was warning them was because some man on the phone had predicted this, and that made me feel trapped between the reality I was witnessing and the impossible explanation that no one would believe. I watched her walk past the benches, scanning the area, and I could see the faint reflection of headlights in the distance, subtle shift in the shadows as a figure emerged, tall, moving deliberately, and I realized that I was too far away, too late to intervene physically. And that's when the panic truly set in, the kind that makes your mind race uncontrollably, your thoughts spinning through every possible scenario, trying to decide which action might make a difference without putting me or her in immediate danger. I called the police on speakerphone, keeping the line open, whispering to them about what I saw, giving them precise directions, hoping against hope they would believe me. And as I did, the the figure drew closer, moving around the lamppost. The darkness masking details, but the posture, the pace, the intensity was unmistakable. And I felt a wave of nausea and terror crash over me, because I knew that if law enforcement didn't arrive immediately, that would be another victim. And it was my fault. I hadn't predicted the exact timing, only the location. Minutes stretched into an unbearable eternity. The night filled with the sounds of distant traffic, barking dogs, and the soft rustle of leaves. Until finally, flashing lights appeared down the street, sirens blaring, and the figure hesitated, disappearing momentarily behind the trees. And I realized in that instant that my notes, my charts, my obsession with the pattern had saved a life, not completely, not perfectly, but enough that the police could intervene. And the relief that washed over me was so intense it left me trembling, tears streaming down my face in the cold night air, because I knew I had finally turned the tide, even if only a little, against the calculated cruelty of the man who had drawn me into his twisted game. After the police took over and escorted the woman to safety, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the dark streets, trying to comprehend what had just happened, replaying the calls, the predictions, the tense hours of waiting. And I realized that from this point forward, my life, my work, and every decision I made would be shaped by the knowledge that the man on the phone was still out there, watching, testing, and that any time he called again, it could mean life or death. And that realization filled me with both dread and determination, because I couldn't allow myself to be passive anymore, not after seeing the pattern, not after understanding the rhythm, and certainly not after knowing that for the first time my actions had made a difference. The night after the near miss at the park, I barely slept, my mind replaying the events over and over, each detail sharpened in my memory. From the exact time the woman had appeared to the faint rustle of leaves that had betrayed the figure approaching. And as I sat at my kitchen table with a half-empty cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, I realized that nothing in my life would ever feel normal again, because I had glimpsed the reality of what it meant to be entangled in the presence of someone who planned death as if it were a chess game, methodical, patient, and cruel. And that realization made my stomach churn constantly, gnawing at me until every meal felt tasteless and every quiet moment felt dangerous. Over the next several days, I kept meticulous logs, not only of the calls, but of every minor detail I could observe in the news, the police reports, social media updates, and even conversations overheard in public places, trying to see patterns. And sometimes the smallest detail would make my heart leap, like a news blurb about a road closure or a flyer for a local event, because the man's predictions often hinged on timing and geography, and if I missed something small, it could have devastating consequences. Yet at the same time, I felt powerless because I had no official authority to act, no real means to protect anyone except through observation, documentation, and an anxious hope that law enforcement would respond quickly enough. And then the calls began again, almost as if he knew I had been keeping watch, almost as if he wanted me to feel the anxiety that comes with knowing in advance and still being unable to stop it completely. On the first call after the park incident, came in the late hours of the evening, blocked number, the same low, deliberate voice, saying, "You saw her tonight. That's good. Cute, kept her safe. Soon you'll see why it matters." And my pulse hammered so hard in my chest that I felt it in my throat, because the words were both praise and warning, acknowledgement and threat, all wrapped into one. And I knew that the next disappearance was already being set up, already unfolding in some part of the city that I had yet to identify. And my brain immediately went to work, cataloging, cross-referencing, and analyzing, trying to decipher even the subtlest hint embedded in his tone, in the phrasing, in the slight pauses, all in an effort to stay one step ahead without alerting him to my scrutiny. I started sleeping with the phone by my side, always on, and every ring made my chest tighten, 'cause I'd learned that ignoring the calls wasn't an option, that information could save a life, even if it came at the cost of my sanity. And I spent hours pacing my apartment, tracing the locations he described in my notebook, mapping them on a city map with pens and colored thread to mark potential routes, trying to anticipate where he would strike next. And every time I thought I had it figured out, a detail he mentioned would force me to adjust, to reconsider, and the sense of urgency, of being drawn into a game I didn't want to play, became suffocating. One evening, I noticed a pattern emerging that made my stomach drop. I realized that the times between the calls were shortening, the intervals between predicted disappearances shrinking, which meant that he was escalating, increasing the tempo of his actions, and the realization that there might soon be multiple victims in a single day filled me with dread, 'cause I had only been able to track and anticipate one event at a time, and the thought of being overwhelmed, of not being able to provide any useful guidance to law enforcement, made my hands shake uncontrollably. And then the call came, late at night, a whisper over the line, "They're moving faster now. Can you keep up?" And I felt a chill slide down my spine, because the question wasn't rhetorical. He was testing me, seeing if I could still track. The rhythm of his actions and the subtle menace in his tone made it clear that failing wasn't an option. Over the following days, I began to notice small things in my own life, shifting unfamiliar cars parked near my apartment, shadows moving just beyond the streetlights, the feeling of being followed whenever I went outside, subtle disturbances in my apartment that I could almost dismiss as forgetfulness, but couldn't completely ignore, and the awareness that he might be monitoring me, not just the city, made the stakes unbearably high, 'cause I realized that this wasn't just about watching victims before they disappeared, it was about controlling me, shaping my every decision, forcing me into a position of constant vigilance and fear. And yet, despite the terror, I couldn't stop. I couldn't unsee what he had shown me, couldn't unhear his voice, couldn't unlearn the pattern, and that tension, that constant fear, mixed with the drive to act, became my life. The media began to pick up on the missing persons reports, the local news covering multiple disappearances with increasing concern. But there was nothing connecting them, at least nothing the public could see. And I began to realize that without the calls, without the subtle instructions and hints, the police might never be able to piece together the connection. And I felt the weight of responsibility press on me, heavy and relentless, because in a sense, I was the only one who could see the whole picture. I began meeting with Detective Harris and a small task force discreetly, sharing my notes, my maps, my interpretations of the calls, trying to communicate what I had learned without giving away that I was now intimately involved in tracking a murderer's patterns, and watching the detectives react, their faces tense, some skeptical, some quietly horrified, made me feel simultaneously validated and terrified, because the more they understood, the more they realized the scope of what we were dealing with. And I knew that the man on the phone would escalate if he discovered that his warnings were being used to thwart him. The tension came to a head one night when the call came during a thunderstorm, rain lashing against the windows, the phone vibrating in my hand with an urgency that made my heart pound, and the voice said, "Tonight will be different. Watch closely. Do not blink." And I could feel a pulse of fear unlike anything before, 'cause the words weren't just a warning, they were a command, a challenge, a promise. And I realized that whatever was about to happen, I would have to be fully engaged, fully alert, or risk another tragedy. I spent the night mapping out every possible location he could strike, noting patterns, distances, the time it would take for a person to travel from one point to another. And I barely slept, barely ate, my body fueled by adrenaline and anxiety. And when morning came, I drove to the location he had hinted at, parked discreetly, and waited, watching every passerby, every shadow, every movement in the dim light of dawn. The city waking up around me while I felt suspended in a bubble of fear and anticipation, knowing that somewhere the man was orchestrating events that I could see unfolding in part, but never fully, and that the next few hours would determine whether another life would be claimed or saved, and that awareness was like a weight pressing on my chest, a constant reminder that I was caught in the middle of something far bigger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. After the tense hours I spent at the park, watching every shadow and anticipating every movement, I realized that I couldn't remain passive any longer, cause it had become painfully clear that the man on the phone wasn't just interested in informing me of his plans. He wanted me involved in a way that was subtle but undeniable, forcing me to track, anticipate, and make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. And the weight of that responsibility was crushing, sitting on my chest like a physical object, pressing me into a constant state of anxiety and hyper-awareness, where even a moment of inattention could result in catastrophe. Over the next several days, I found myself obsessively mapping out every call, every hint, every subtle clue that he had given, and my apartment became a war room of sticky notes, lines, color-coded strings, maps, and notes, everything connecting into a web that I could barely see the edges of, but which I desperately tried to understand, because I knew that doing so was the only way to save anyone else, to at least have a chance to intervene before another person disappeared. And yet the constant presence of his voice in my mind, the memory of that calm, deliberate tone, made it impossible to rest, impossible to relax, impossible to stop thinking about what might happen next. Then, one night, just past midnight, the phone rang, shrill in the silence of my apartment, and when I answered, the voice was different, still deliberate, but with a hint of amusement, like he was enjoying the fact that I was now actively involved in his twisted game. And he said, "You're getting good at this. You're beginning to see the whole picture. But tonight, we'll see if you're ready to take the next step." And my hands shook so badly that I could barely hold the receiver, because the phrase "next step" sounded like a challenge, a test, and I realized that he wasn't just predicting disappearances anymore. He was guiding me into a role I had no training for, no authority for, but one I could not ignore. Over the next several hours, he walked me through a series of subtle hints about a new location, verses that at first seemed meaningless, but which I slowly pieced together, mapping the streets, the time of day, the possible routes, the patterns of foot traffic, everything in preparation. And as I followed his instructions, I realized that the line between observation and action was blurring, that I was no longer merely an outside witness, but a participant in a chain of events that I couldn't fully control. And the thought both terrified and galvanized me, because I understood that if I hesitated, if I misinterpreted even one detail, the consequences would be catastrophic. When morning came, I drove to the location he had indicated, a narrow alley behind a series of small shops, and parked at a distance where I could see without being seen, scanning every movement, every person, every shadow, and the tension was unbearable. My body coiled tight with anxiety, every nerve on edge, every instinct screaming that I needed to act. And yet, I also knew that any misstep could not only endanger the potential victim, but also reveal my presence, which would complicate everything, because the man on the phone was always observing, always manipulating, always in control in a way I could barely comprehend. As the hours passed, I noticed subtle movements of figure lingering near the corner. A young woman walking alone, glancing around nervously. And I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that I was witnessing the unfolding of another disappearance. Unless I intervened, unless I could act quickly and decisively. And my hands shook as I reached for my phone to call the police. whispering directions into the receiver. My eyes never leaving the alley, heart pounding so hard that it felt like it would burst from my chest, and I prayed silently that they would arrive before it was too late. Then the figure moved closer, shadows shifting, and I could see the outline of someone approaching her from the darkness, deliberate, careful, and my stomach dropped because I knew that this was exactly what he had predicted, exactly the scenario he had described in his riddles and subtle clues, and I felt a surge of terror mixed with determination, because I couldn't let another person be taken, couldn't allow his plans to unfold unchallenged, even though I knew that intervening directly could be dangerous, that I was still only one person against a calculated predator who had studied patterns, timing, and human behavior meticulously. I followed his instructions as best I could, noting landmarks, subtle cues, gestures, anything that could help the police intercept him. And as I did, I realized that this wasn't just about stopping a crime anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could function under extreme pressure, that I could act with clarity despite the fear that threatened to paralyze me at every moment. And I understood that the man on the phone had designed this interaction to test me, to see how far he could push me, how deeply he could draw me into his web without me realizing that I was no longer an observer, but a critical part of the unfolding events. Finally, just as the young woman reached the center of the alley, headlights appeared, police sirens blaring in the distance, and the approaching figure hesitated, momentarily obscured by shadows. And I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost knocked me off balance, because the presence of law enforcement meant that my actions, my interpretations, my obsessive mapping of the calls had made a tangible difference, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a fragile sense of control, a sense that I could influence outcomes, that my efforts were not in vain, that the notes, the patterns, the sleepless nights, and the constant fear had a purpose beyond torment. After the police apprehended the figure, I was left standing in the damp alley, rain dripping from my hair and coat, the adrenaline still coursing through my body, and I realized that I had crossed a line, that from this point forward I could never go back to the passive life I had known before the calls, because I had seen the face of danger, interacted with it in a direct way, and survived. And the knowledge of my own capability, while empowering, was inseparable from the lingering terror that he was still out there, still watching, still manipulating, and I understood that every future call, every hint, every prediction would demand the same level of attention, courage, and focus, because the moment I faltered, the lives of innocent people would be at stake, and I had no choice but to continue, no choice but to remain vigilant, no choice but to follow the pattern, map the clues, anticipate the moves, and live with the constant, unrelenting awareness that the man on the phone had changed my life forever, and that I would never be the same again. The weeks after the alley incident were a blur of calls, maps, charts, and constant vigilance, and I could feel myself changing in ways I didn't recognize, like my old life, the normal routines, the simple pleasures. The ability to sleep without fear had been stripped away completely, leaving only this heightened state of alert, where every phone ring made my heart stop, and every shadow in the street felt like it could be him watching. And I became almost addicted to the pattern, to the tracking, to the sense of control that came from decoding his hints and trying to anticipate his next move, even though it was terrifying and exhausting. And I knew I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. Then, one night, late, when the city was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog, the phone rang again, and I felt the familiar dread tighten my chest before I even answered, because the number was blocked, the same as always, and when I picked up, the voice that had become so hauntingly familiar was there, calm, measured, and colder than I had ever heard it before, saying, "Tonight, you will see everything," and I froze, because the weight, of that statement, so simple yet ominous, made every instinct in me scream that something unprecedented was about to happen, something that would test me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And I gripped the receiver like it was a lifeline, my fingers digging into the plastic as if holding on could somehow anchor me to reality in the midst of what was coming. Over the next hour, he spoke in riddles, vague hints, and fragmented directions, and I scribbled frantically in my notebook, trying to decode what he meant. But the clues were different this time. They weren't just about locations or potential victims. They were about timing, about sequences, about movement, about watching how people reacted, and it dawned on me that he was taking the game to a new level, pushing me further into a role I had never agreed to, never anticipated, and yet couldn't ignore, because the stakes were unbearably high, and any hesitation or misstep could mean a life lost. When I finally stepped outside into the cold night, carrying my backpack, notebook, and flashlight, the rain falling lightly, slicking the streets with reflections of streetlights, I realized I had no idea what I was walking into, only that I had to follow the pattern, to be present, to anticipate, to act without fully understanding the rules. And the terror of that uncertainty gripped me with a force I had never known, 'cause I understood that from this point forward, I was crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. I walked through the darkened streets, following the hints he had given, every step measured, every glance over my shoulder, a reminder that he could be observing, that he could be influencing even my movements without me realizing. And when I reached the first location, a quiet street corner near an abandoned warehouse, I froze, because the scene unfolding in front of me was unlike anything I had experienced. There were shadows moving deliberately, figures crossing paths in ways that seemed orchestrated. I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that I was now witnessing multiple potential incidents at once, a sequence designed to overwhelm me, to test my ability to follow, predict, and act simultaneously. And the weight of that responsibility pressed down like a physical force on my shoulders, making my movements sluggish, my heart hammering so violently it felt like it would burst from my chest. Over the next several hours, I moved carefully from location to location, following the subtle hints, observing patterns, noting every detail, the length of shadows, the movement of cars, the timing of pedestrians, the rhythm of footsteps, the occasional flash of someone's coat or hair, all the while holding my breath, knowing that one wrong glance, one wrong calculation could result in disaster. And the phone rang intermittently, sometimes with his voice, sometimes with silence, sometimes with static, each call adding another layer of tension, another puzzle to solve, another piece of the night's sequence to interpret and act upon. At one point, I found myself crouched behind a low fence, notebook open on my knees, flashlight casting faint shadows across the pavement. As I traced the movements of a figure that had appeared around a corner, its posture and pace eerily familiar, and I realized that I had seen that behavior in my notes before, in past predictions, and I understood then that he wasn't just teaching me to anticipate random events. He was training me, molding me, conditioning me to respond, to predict, to feel the fear, and yet keep functioning with clarity. In the awareness of this duality, the training disguised as a nightmare, made my mind reel with exhaustion, because it was brilliant in its cruelty and terrifying in its effectiveness. Hours passed in this way, the city dark and quiet around me, punctuated only by distant sirens, occasional car horns, the subtle movement of shadows, and the constant low hum of anxiety that had become my baseline. And when I finally reached the last location he had indicated, a small park behind an apartment complex, I crouched behind a bush, flashlight low, breathing shallow, and watched as a young woman entered, oblivious to the danger that might be nearby. And I felt a wave of nausea, because the scenario he had described was unfolding perfectly, almost as if he had rehearsed it in advance, and yet I was powerless to intervene directly without risking exposure, or worse, and my hand shook as I reached for the phone to alert the police, whispering directions with every ounce of focus I had, my eyes darting back and forth, tracking the figure approaching her, heart pounding, adrenaline surging, body tense, mind racing to calculate timing, distance, and the potential outcomes of every movement. Then, just as the figure drew close, a light flashed in the distance. Sirens blared, and the police emerged, interrupting the scene, and I felt a brief, overwhelming surge of relief, because my tracking, my mapping, my obsessive following of the calls had led to a tangible result, had helped prevent another tragedy. At least partially, but that relief was quickly replaced by a cold, lingering terror. Because I knew that the man on the phone had been orchestrating this entire sequence, had been testing me, observing my reactions, and would continue to escalate. In the realization that I had now fully crossed into active involvement, that I was no longer merely an observer, but a participant under his guidance, made my stomach twist in a way I could not shake. As the police detained the figure, I backed away, still crouched behind the bush, notebook clutched to my chest. And I realized with a profound clarity that from this point forward, my life would never be the same, that the man on the phone had irrevocably altered the course of my existence, drawing me into a pattern of observation, anticipation, and action that was simultaneously empowering and horrifying. And I understood that I would have to continue, not because I wanted to, but because the stakes were too high, the consequences too severe, and the lives of innocent people depended on my ability to follow the rhythm he had established, decode the sequence, and act decisively under conditions that would have paralyzed almost anyone else. I walked home in the early hours, rain slicking the streets, body trembling, mind buzzing with calculations, observations, and fear. And when I finally reached my apartment and locked the door behind me, I sat in the dark notebook, open on the table, flashlight casting faint lines across my charts and maps, and I realized that the calls would continue, the pattern would continue, and my role in his twisted game had shifted permanently, was now a key player, a participant, a witness, and a guardian all at once. In the knowledge of this duality, the constant oscillation between terror and control, between helplessness and influence, would define the rest of my life as long as he remained out there, swatching, guiding, and predicting, orchestrating events from somewhere beyond my reach. And I understood with a cold, unwavering clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. After that night in the park, I realized with a cold clarity that I could no longer function like a normal person, that the constant vigilance, obsession with mapping his calls, the sleepless nights spent tracking patterns and cross-referencing locations had completely consumed my life. And every waking moment was dominated by the fear that the next call could mean life or death for someone, and that the man on the phone would escalate again, just as he always did, testing the limits of my endurance and my ability to respond under pressure. And it was during this period of hyper-awareness that I started noticing subtle things I had missed before. Unfamiliar cars parked near my apartment, shadows moving just beyond the streetlights, doors that seemed to have been opened or closed when I was sure I hadn't touched them. All the while, knowing that he was likely aware of my every move, observing, manipulating, and pushing me further into a role I had never wanted, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me constantly like a physical presence in the room, making it impossible to relax, impossible to eat, impossible to sleep. One night, well past midnight, the phone rang again, and I could feel my stomach twist before I even picked it up, because the number was blocked. As always, and when I answered, the voice was colder, sharper, more deliberate than ever, almost taunting, saying, "You're ready now. Tonight, you will see everything unfold, and you understand why I've been guiding you. And those words hit me like a punch to the chest, because they implied a level of orchestration and planning beyond anything I had previously imagined. And I realized that this was no longer just about predicting disappearances or giving law enforcement hints. It was about controlling the narrative, shaping the events in real time, and drawing me into direct involvement in ways I had never agreed to, and yet refusing to follow. Ignoring the instructions seemed impossible, because I knew what would happen if I faltered. Over the next several hours, he walked me through a series of hints, locations, timing cues, and subtle gestures, cryptic yet precise. And as I scribbled notes furiously in my notebook, my heart pounding and my hands shaking, I realized that he had designed a chain of events intended to test not only my observation skills, but my ability to act, to anticipate, to make decisions that could literally mean the difference between life and death. And the complexity of it left me reeling, because I had never been trained, never been prepared for this, and yet I was fully aware that I had no choice but to follow, to track, to act. I left my apartment, rain-slicking streets reflecting the dim streetlights, backpack on my shoulders, notebook in hand, flashlight in the other. And I moved with calculated caution, every sense on high alert, aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow, knowing that the man on the phone could be anywhere, watching, testing, seeing if I would respond correctly, and the weight of that awareness was suffocating. A constant pressure that pressed on my chest made my breathing shallow and kept my mind spinning in a whirlwind of fear, anticipation, and adrenaline. The first location he had hinted at was an abandoned warehouse near the edge of the city, and as I approached, crouching in the shadows, I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that the area had been staged, almost theatrically, to draw my attention to specific details, subtle signs meant to guide me through the sequence he had designed. And I understood then that this wasn't just observation anymore, was a trap, a puzzle, a test, and I was the primary piece, the crucial component whose decisions could determine the outcome. I followed his cryptic instructions through a sequence of streets, alleyways, and hidden passages, seeing every small detail, the flicker of a light in a window, the movement of a stray cat, the pattern of rain dripping from rooftops, everything that could serve as a clue, a guide, or a warning. And as I moved, I realized with a growing sense of dread that he had anticipated my reactions at every turn, planned for my hesitations, and embedded contingencies into the sequence that I was following blindly. And the realization that I was walking through, a fully orchestrated chain of events designed to manipulate me, made my skin crawl, as my hands tremble, and my heart hammer uncontrollably in my chest. After hours of tracking, the final location appeared before me, a narrow courtyard behind a cluster of apartments, dimly lit, shadows stretching long across wet pavement, the smell of damp concrete and rust filling the air. And as I crouched behind a dumpster, notebook open, flashlight low, I could see her, a young woman, moving hesitantly, glancing around as if she knew something was off, and my stomach twisted, because this was the moment, the culmination of the night's sequence, and I understood fully that any mistake, any miscalculation, could mean she would become the next victim. That the man on the phone had designed the scenario to maximize pressure, to test my ability to respond under extreme fear, and that knowledge made every nerve in my body taut with tension, trembling, and anticipation. I reached for my phone to call the police, whispering directions into the receiver while keeping my eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Heart racing, mind spinning through multiple possible outcomes, weighing every action, every step, every possibility, trying to calculate what would prevent a tragedy without exposing myself or escalating the danger. And as I did, the figure approached her, deliberate, calculated, moving with a patience that was horrifying. And I felt my chest tighten with a terror so intense I thought I might collapse. knowing that I had only moments to act, only seconds to influence the outcome, and yet I was powerless to confront him directly, powerless to intervene physically, without risking everything, powerless except for my ability to communicate, to guide, to anticipate. And then, just as the figure reached the point where the attack would occur, the police arrived, lights flashing, sirens piercing the night, and the figure hesitated, shadows obscuring details. And I felt a surge of relief, a brief, fleeting sense of control, because my notes, my tracking, taint, my obsessive following of the sequence had contributed to this intervention. Taint had helped prevent a life from being lost, at least temporarily. And yet, even as relief washed over me, a cold, lingering dread settled in my chest, because I knew that the man on the phone had been observing, had anticipated my every move, and would escalate again, would design a new sequence, would continue to manipulate, test, and challenge me. And that realization made my hands shake and my mind reel, because I understood that this was no longer just a series of calls. It was a game, training, a trap, and I was in the center of it, fully and irrevocably. I walked home in the early morning hours, rain still slicking the streets, notebook clutched to my chest, flashlight casting faint lines across the maps and notes I had spread on my table. And I realized that my life had changed permanently, that I was no longer an observer of danger, but an active participant, that the pattern had drawn me in completely, and that from this moment forward, I would be living under the constant shadow of the man on the phone, tracking his calls, interpreting his clues, anticipating his actions, and operating under a level of pressure, fear, responsibility that I had never imagined possible. And I understood, with a chilling clarity, that nothing, no sleep, no comfort, no return to normal life would ever be the same again. It had been several days since the last near miss, and even though the police had intervened in the sequence of events I had tracked had been disrupted, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man on the phone was already planning the next phase, already watching me, already calculating how far he could push me. And the tension was like a living thing pressing on my chest, weighing me down, making every decision feel monumental. Every sound in the apartment, a possible warning. Every shadow outside my window, a potential observer. And I had reached the point where the constant anxiety had begun to infiltrate every part of my life. My thoughts consumed with anticipation, analysis, and fear, while my sleep became fractured. Nightmares blending with reality, leaving me exhausted, yet hyper-aware, unable to turn away from the pattern, unable to stop following the calls, because I knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. Then, in the dead of night, the phone rang again, the shrill sound echoing through my apartment, and my body stiffened, heart hammering, hands trembling as I reached for it, knowing before I even spoke that it was him, that the calm, deliberate voice would be on the other end. And when I answered, he spoke immediately, almost conversationally, yet with a subtle undercurrent of menace that made my stomach twist, saying, "You've done well so far, but tonight will be different. Pay attention, do not stray from the instructions, or it will cost someone dearly." And I felt the weight of those words pressing down on me like a physical force, making my hands shake as I scribbled notes, trying to capture every inflection, every pause, every nuance that could reveal a hidden meaning, a subtle hint, a clue about what was to come. Over the next hour, he guided me through a series of vague instructions that initially seemed disconnected references to a street I didn't recognize, times that felt arbitrary, gestures or movements that might be missed by anyone who wasn't paying absolute attention. But as I wrote furiously, mapping each piece of information, I realized that they formed a sequence, a chain of events that would converge in a single location. And the urgency in his voice made it clear that I had to follow it exactly, because one misstep could result in tragedy. and the thought of being responsible for someone's death because I had misread his subtle hints made my chest tighten and my mind spin with fear. I left my apartment just past midnight, the city streets slick with rain, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other, backpacks slung over my shoulders, and as I moved cautiously through the familiar streets, I noticed details I had never observed before: the sound of water dripping from fire escapes, the faint hum of electricity from streetlights, the rhythm of distant traffic, the subtle changes in shadows caused by flickering neon signs. And I realized that every small observation might be crucial, that the sequence he had orchestrated depended on precise timing, that I had to be aware of everything because missing even a minor detail could have catastrophic consequences. As I navigated through alleyways and side streets, following the cryptic instructions he had given, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. Because the hints were more complex this time, requiring me to track multiple figures simultaneously, to anticipate movements that I couldn't fully see, to calculate distances, timings, and probabilities in real time, and the overwhelming complexity of it made my mind reel. My hands shake, my pulse race, and yet, despite the terror, I felt compelled to continue, because the lives of potential victims depended on my ability to follow the pattern and interpret the subtle cues embedded in his instructions. Hours passed as I moved through the darkened city, the rain soaking through my clothes, feet aching, eyes strained, mind spinning, and I realized that I was no longer merely observing. I was participating in a carefully orchestrated scenario, a trap that had been set not only for potential victims, but also for me, testing my ability to act under extreme pressure, to think clearly while fear coursed through every nerve, to make decisions that could save lives or cost them, and the awareness that I was central to the unfolding events made the tension unbearable, making each step heavier, each breath more labored, its decision more critical. Eventually, arrived at a location that matched one of the landmarks he had described: a small park hidden behind an apartment complex. Dimly lit, shadows stretching across benches and pathways, the smell of wet concrete and leaves filling the air, and I crouched behind a low wall, notebook open, flashlight low, heart pounding, and watched as a young woman entered, seemingly unaware of the danger that might be near, glancing nervously around as she walked, and I felt my stomach twist, knowing that this was the moment, the culmination of the night's chain, and that everything depended on my actions, my interpretations, my ability to anticipate and guide law enforcement without exposing myself or escalating the situation. I reached for my phone to call the police, whispering directions, describing her location, the movements I observed, the possible approaches of any figure that might be following her. My hands shaking as I spoke, my pulse racing, mind spinning through multiple scenarios, trying to calculate timing, distance, and possible interventions, knowing that one wrong word or delayed action could be catastrophic. And yet, despite the fear, I felt a grim determination, a sense of purpose that overrode my exhaustion and anxiety, because I understood that I had the ability to influence the outcome, to intervene indirectly, to prevent a tragedy if I remained focused and precise. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, deliberate, patient, moving toward the woman with an almost mechanical precision, and my stomach dropped, my chest tightening with terror, because this was exactly the scenario he had predicted, and I realized that I was witnessing the unfolding of a carefully orchestrated plan, a chain of events designed to push me to my limits in the cold. Deliberate calculation of the figure's movements made it clear that he had anticipated every possible variable, every reaction, every potential obstacle, and had accounted for them in the sequence that I was now navigating. As the figure drew closer, I whispered directions to the police, guiding them to intervene at the critical moment, my hands trembling, my mind racing with calculations, observations, and fear. And finally, just as the figure reached the point where the attack might occur, police sirens wailed, lights flashing, and the figure hesitated, obscured by shadows. And I felt a surge of relief, so intense it made my body shake, knowing that the intervention had prevented the immediate danger, at least temporarily, and that my obsessive tracking, mapping, and interpretation of the calls had contributed to saving a life, even if only partially. As the police apprehended the figure, I stepped back into the shadows, heart still hammering, notebook clutched to my chest, flashlight low, a tea, and I realized with a profound clarity that this was no longer just a series of calls, no longer just patterns and predictions. It was a test, a training, a trap, and I was at the center, fully involved, fully implicated, and irrevocably changed. And the awareness of this fact pressed down on me with a weight I could barely endure, because I knew that the man on the phone would continue, would escalate further, would continue to manipulate and challenge me, that my life would never again be simple, normal, or safe, and that every future call, every hint, every prediction would demand the same level of vigilance, clarity, and courage, because failure was not an option. In the lives of innocent people depended on my ability to follow the pattern, interpret the cues, and act decisively, under circumstances that would have paralyzed almost anyone else. I walked home in the early hours, rain still falling lightly, streets glistening, notebook clutched tightly, body trembling, mind buzzing with fear, anticipation, and exhaustion. And when I finally reached my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sank into a chair in the dark, I understood with chilling clarity that the man on the phone had irrevocably altered my existence, that I was now a participant in a game I had not asked to play, and that from this moment on, my life would be defined by the cause, the patterns, the sequences, the constant tension, and the inescapable reality that the next call could arrive at any moment, demanding that I act, anticipate, can navigate the deadly sequences he designed with a precision and cruelty that left me both terrified and obsessed. The following week was one of the most terrifying periods of my life, because even though I had survived the previous sequences and had managed to prevent the immediate danger that night in the park, I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the man on the phone had shifted his tactics, that he was no longer content to communicate only through cryptic calls and indirect hints, but that he was beginning to encroach on my personal space, my sense of safety, my own home. And the thought of someone capable of orchestrating such precise, cold, and calculated sequences, now invading the place where I slept, ate, and tried to find even a moment of peace, made every hair on my body stand on end, because it became impossible to tell whether the sounds I heard at night, the faint creak of a floorboard, the soft thump of something being moved in another room, the whisper of air through a slightly ajar window, were real intrusions or products of my overstimulated imagination. Yet every instinct screamed that this time the danger had moved closer, that the line between observation and direct threat had been crossed, and that the man on the phone was testing not only my ability to track events, but my capacity to endure constant, intimate terror, knowing that the psychological pressure of having my personal sanctuary violated would push me to a breaking point. And then it happened in the middle of the night, when I was jolted awake by the faint click of a door that I was sure had been locked. The unmistakable sound of someone entering my apartment, and my body froze, breath caught in my chest, heart hammering as I clutched my phone and flashlight, trying to make sense of the noises without revealing my presence. And every second stretched into an eternity as I realized that the man I had been tracking, observing, and anticipating had somehow moved closer than I had ever imagined possible, testing the boundaries of my fear and my ability to act under extreme duress. I slowly crept from my bedroom toward the living area, trying to make as little noise as possible, flashlight beam scanning across the walls and furniture, and as I moved, I could see faint shadows cast by the dim glow of streetlights through the blinds. Movement that wasn't mine, subtle but deliberate, and my stomach twisted with a sickening mix of terror and adrenaline, because I understood that this was no longer a hypothetical threat, a distant puzzle to be solved, but an immediate, tangible danger, and any misstep could result in personal harm or worse, allow him to manipulate events that might endanger others in ways I could not yet see. The intruder moved with precision, deliberately avoiding areas I had placed tripwires and small obstacles, almost as if he had studied my apartment in advance, memorized the layout, and knew exactly how to remain undetected while still asserting control over the space, and I realized then with chilling clarity that his observation had extended far beyond the cause and sequences it now encompassed me. My movements, my routines, my environment, and the psychological manipulation of fear itself had become as central to his game as the disappearances he orchestrated across the city. Over the next several tense minutes, I tracked his movements, silently shifting from shadow to shadow, flashlight low, notebook clutched in one hand, phone in the other, whispering directions to the police as best as I could without revealing my exact location, trying to anticipate his path, and my mind raced through scenarios, calculating the consequences of every action, weighing whether to confront, evade, or continue observation, knowing that a single mistake could turn the situation lethal, yet compelled to remain engaged because I had come to understand that inaction in this game was never a safe choice, and that the consequences of failing to act responsibly extended far beyond myself. And then I saw him, a figure crouched near the kitchen, barely visible in the low light, deliberate, careful, scanning the room as though searching for something. And my chest tightened so hard it felt like it would collapse, because I recognized the precision, the patience, the cold calculation I had come to associate with him. And I realized that everything I had learned through his previous calls, the timing, the anticipation, the interpretation of subtle cues, was now being applied in real time against me, making me both observer and participant in a scenario designed to terrify and test me simultaneously. I whispered into the phone, giving what I hoped were subtle directions to the police without revealing my presence, while simultaneously mapping his movements in my notebook, noting every pause, every gesture, every potential threat. And as I did, I could feel the psychological tension winding tighter, my body coiled with adrenaline and fear, because I understood that he had escalated beyond the sequences I had previously tracked, now directly intruding into my life, challenging my ability to respond under the most personal and immediate circumstances, and that the success of my interventions relied not only on my observation skills, but on my mental endurance, clarity, and ability to remain calm while every instinct screamed to flee or confront. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the rain tapping against the windows, my breathing shallow, my muscles tense, and then, as if on cue, the intruder paused, crouched, listening intently, and I realized that he was aware I was present, that my own movements, my silent calculations, had been observed, and the chilling awareness that I was no longer just tracking him, but that he was tracking me, created a feedback loop of terror, anticipation, and heightened focus, each feeding the other. And I understood in that moment that the dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer merely following his game. I was now fully part of it, entwined in a direct, dangerous, and psychological confrontation that had no precedent in my previous experiences, and the stakes could not have been higher. Finally, a flash of headlights from outside, followed by sirens, announced the police's arrival, and the figure froze, shadows stretching and twisting, hesitant, calculating, and I felt a surge of relief and fear all at once, knowing that while Law enforcement's presence had disrupted his immediate actions. It did not diminish his reach or his capacity for manipulation, and I was left trembling, notebook in hand, flashlight still low, heart hammering, mind racing through the implications, knowing that this break-in was both a warning and a message, a demonstration of his reach, his observation, and the psychological control he exerted, and that from this point on, no space would be truly safe, no location truly private, no moment of peace guaranteed. I spent the next several days taking precautions I had never considered before, installing new locks, checking every entry point, setting up cameras, monitoring every street, alley, and sidewalk near my apartment. Yet, even with these measures, the lingering terror persisted, because I knew that his observation and manipulation were not limited by physical barriers, okay? And the calls, the sequences, the instructions would continue, each more complex, each more psychologically demanding. And I realized with chilling clarity that the break-in had changed everything. I was no longer just tracking patterns, anticipating disappearances, and guiding law enforcement. I was now living under the constant shadow of a predator who had proven he could manipulate my personal space, my environment, and my psyche, and that the stakes had never been higher. The pressure never more intense, and the terror never more intimate, personal, and unavoidable. And as I sat in the dark, notebook open, flashlight casting faint lines across my charts and maps, rain dripping from the eaves outside, I understood that from this point forward, every call, every hint, every sequence would be a test not only of my observation skills, but of my mental endurance, my courage, and my ability to survive the psychological pressure he was applying. And that my life had been irrevocably altered, permanently entangled with a man whose reach, calculation, and cruelty had no bounds, and whose next move I could neither predict fully nor avoid completely, yet had no choice but to face with as much clarity, precision, and vigilance as I could summon, because the lives of others and my own survival depended entirely on my ability to act under conditions that were designed to push me beyond the limits of fear, endurance, and comprehension. After the terrifying break-in, the fear that had settled into the core of my being didn't fade, okay? In fact, it only intensified, okay? Because I realized that the man on the phone had now not only demonstrated his reach into my personal space, but had also shown that he could manipulate the environment around me in ways I hadn't previously imagined. And that awareness made every sound in the apartment, every passing car, every shadow on the walls feel like a potential threat, and the anxiety became so pervasive that I barely slept, barely ate, and spent hours scanning maps, reviewing notes, and attempting to anticipate his next sequence of calls, because I had learned through bitter experience that failing to follow or misinterpreting his subtle instructions could have disastrous consequences. Then, one afternoon, while reviewing my notebook and cross-referencing patterns from the last several sequences, the phone rang, blocked number as always, and my pulse leaped violently in my chest, hands trembling as I answered, expecting the familiar, cold, measured voice to fill my ears with cryptic instructions. And this time, he spoke differently, almost conversationally, almost casually, with an undercurrent of menace that made my skin crawl, saying, "You're going to see someone you care about in a new light tonight. Watch carefully, record everything." And I froze, stomach knotting, because I had no idea who he meant. And the vague phrasing implied that his next sequence would target not only strangers, but potentially someone close to me. Then the thought of being drawn into such a scenario made my chest tighten and my mind spin, because it would be impossible to predict or control entirely. And yet, I knew I had no choice but to follow every instruction to the letter. Over the next hour, he guided me through a series of movements, locations, and observations that at first seemed random references to street corners, abandoned storefronts, people moving in patterns I could barely interpret it, but as I recorded notes and mapped the movements, I began to see a larger picture emerge. He was orchestrating a scenario designed to place me, potentially someone I knew, into the same environment as a potential victim, creating a live, real-time observation scenario that would test my nerves, my decision-making, and my ability to act under pressure. And the realization that someone I cared about might unknowingly become part of his game made the terror almost unbearable, because the stakes had become intensely personal, and the consequences of failure would extend beyond strangers on the streets to someone I valued, someone whose life I might be forced to protect with nothing but observation and interpretation, no direct intervention. I left my apartment well past midnight, rain falling lightly, streets slick and reflective, flashlight in one hand, notebook clutched in the other. Every nerve in my body stretched tight with anticipation and fear, and as I moved, I noticed subtle details that I had previously overlooked: the flicker of a neon sign across the street, the rhythm of footsteps echoing in alleyways, the subtle shift in shadow patterns as a car passed, and I realized that these were all essential cues in the sequence he had designed, each one potentially critical for preventing disaster, each one a test of my ability to remain alert and precise under immense psychological pressure. Hours passed as I followed his cryptic instructions through a network of streets, alleyways, and hidden pathways, observing multiple figures simultaneously, trying to anticipate movements, timing, and patterns, while whispering directions to the police when necessary, and my mind became a world of calculations, probability assessments, and mental maps, because I understood that every decision, every movement, every observation could influence the outcome in ways I could not fully predict, and that one mistake could have catastrophic consequences for the unsuspecting people I was now responsible for guiding and protecting. Eventually, the sequence led me to an abandoned lot on the edge of the city, dimly lit by a few flickering streetlights, where a young man I recognized from a local convenience store, the one I occasionally spoke to while buying coffee, stood, nervously glancing around as though he knew he shouldn't be there, but didn't understand why. And my heart sank, because I realized that he had become the unintentional focus of the man on the phone's game, a lure designed to test my ability to guide and protect someone under real-time threat. And I crouched behind a low fence, flashlight low, notebook open, trying to track both his movements and those of any potential assailants, whispering directions to the police while keeping myself concealed, my body coiled with tension, every muscle trembling, every nerve alert, every thought focused on interpreting subtle cues, anticipating danger, and preventing the worst from happening. As I observed, a shadow emerged from the far end of the lot, deliberate, slow, moving with patience, and I felt my stomach twist with fear, because this was the figure I had come to know, the orchestrator of these sequences, moving in a calculated way toward the young man. And I understood that this was the culmination of the sequence, the moment when all the prior calls, patterns, instructions would be tested in real time, and the pressure to act correctly, decisively, and quickly was almost paralyzing. Yet I forced myself to remain calm, whispering instructions, calculating distances, timing, angles, escape routes, all while tracking movements in my notebook. The tension in my body so intense it felt like it could snap my spine in half. And yet I remained focused, because I knew that failing now could mean death. The figure drew closer, and I could see the precision of his movements, the deliberate patience, the mechanical focus, and I realized that he had anticipated not only the young man's behavior, but mine, that he had considered every potential variable, every reaction, and that this sequence was designed to push me to my absolute limit, to force me to act with clarity under fear that would have paralyzed almost anyone else. And yet I had no choice but to continue, because I had already become part of the sequence, entwined in a live scenario where observation, anticipation, and subtle intervention were all that stood between life and death. Just as the figure reached the point of potential confrontation, distant sirens wailed, headlights flashed, and police vehicles arrived, disrupting the sequence. And the figure froze, hesitated, and then disappeared into the shadows, leaving the young man unharmed but visibly shaken, and I felt a mixture of relief, terror, and exhaustion wash over me, because while the immediate threat had been averted, the psychological impact, the realization of how far this man's influence extended, and the knowledge that the next sequence would escalate further, left me trembling, unable to eat or sleep, and acutely aware that my life had been permanently entwined with his games, that I was now fully immersed in a series of orchestrated events that would continue indefinitely, each more complex and psychologically demanding than the last. I returned home in the early hours, soaked from rain, notebook clutched to my chest, flashlight dimmed, body trembling, mind spinning, and I realized with a chilling clarity that from this point forward, I would never be free from the constant tension, the anticipation, the fear, and the responsibility that had come with becoming a witness, participant, and a guardian in a game orchestrated by a man whose reach, patience, and cruelty knew no bounds, and at every call, every instruction, every sequence would continue to test the limits of my endurance, courage, and ability to act under pressure, because his manipulation was psychological as well as practical, and it stakes the lives of those who unknowingly became involved. My own life had never been higher, leaving me trapped in a reality where vigilance was constant, fear was ever present, and the next call could arrive at any moment, demanding that I respond with precision, clarity, and courage beyond what I had previously imagined possible. The days following the lurid witness incident were some of the most intense of my entire life, because the realization that he could manipulate, observe, and coordinate events without ever being physically visible, and that he had deliberately chosen someone I might recognize to pull me deeper into his game, made every routine task feel like walking through a minefield. And I became hyper-aware of every detail in my environment, checking windows, doors, locks, even the slightest creak of floorboards, while simultaneously scanning my notes, reviewing patterns, and plotting his likely next move. Because I knew from experience that once he escalated, the sequences became more complex, more psychologically taxing, and the consequences of misjudgment became ever more severe. Then, late one night, the phone rang, the blocked number flashing, and my stomach turned to ice as I answered, the familiar, deliberate tone of his voice filling my ears, saying, "Tonight, you'll find a place you've never seen before, and everything you thought you knew about the sequences will be tested." And I felt a shiver run through me, because the implication was clear. He was planning a location entirely outside my previous patterns, forcing me to adapt, to think quickly, to observe, and to act in ways I had not yet been required to. And the thought of venturing into unknown territory while under the pressure of his manipulation filled me with dread, adrenaline, and a heightened sense of urgency. Over the next hour, he spoke in fragments, giving me subtle instructions, times, directions, and gestures to watch for. And though the hints seemed disjointed, as always, I began mapping them, connecting the pieces like a puzzle, my pulse racing, hands trembling as I scribbled down every detail, aware that missing or misinterpreting even a minor cue could mean life or death for someone unknown. Or worse, for someone I had come to care about during these sequences. And I understood that this hidden location, wherever it was, had been meticulously planned to test every skill I had learned over the last several weeks of relentless sequences, calls, and interventions. I left my apartment after midnight, the city streets glistening with rain, the air thick with fog, flashlight in hand, notebook clutched. Body tense, mind racing, as I navigated alleyways, side streets, and abandoned pathways, following subtle, visual cues that he had embedded into the instructions, each step calculated, deliberate, testing my ability to remain calm under extreme psychological pressure while observing, mapping, and anticipating movements that could be deadly if misjudged. And the further I went, the more I realized that the location itself was part of the test, a carefully chosen environment designed to heighten stress, obscure vision, force me to rely on everything I had learned about pattern recognition, timing, and human behavior. Hours passed as I tracked signs, gestures, and movements, all seemingly random, yet carefully orchestrated. My mind racing through every possible scenario, calculating escape routes, timing, intervals, and likely paths, while simultaneously whispering instructions to the police to intervene where possible without revealing my location, and the psychological strain became almost unbearable. My pulse hammering, hands trembling, every nerve in my body stretched taut, yet I forced myself to focus, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever, and that failure was not an option. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I arrived at a derelict building at the edge of an industrial district, windows broken, walls covered in graffiti, and the faint glow of a single streetlight casting long shadows across debris-strewn ground, and I realized with a sinking heart that this was the hidden location he had described, a place deliberately chosen for its isolation, its ability to obscure observation, and its potential to maximize psychological pressure on me. And I crouched behind a rusted fence, flashlight low, notebook open, breath shallow, trying to map the scene without revealing myself, every muscle trembling, every nerve alert, because I knew the sequence was about to unfold in real time, and that the lives of those involved depended entirely on my ability to anticipate, observe, and act with precision. As I scanned the lot, I saw figures emerge one, then another, moving slowly, deliberately, as if aware of my presence, but willing to wait. And my stomach twisted because I recognized the hallmarks of his orchestration: precise timing, controlled pacing, subtle cues that would guide me, test me, and push me to the limits of my endurance. And I realized that this sequence was more complex than any before, involving multiple potential victims, multiple movements, and an environment that obscured visibility and introduced countless variables. I felt the weight of responsibility press down, suffocating, yet impossible to ignore. Over the next several hours, I observed, tracked, and guided, whispering to the police, calculating angles, timing, and probabilities, recording movements in my notebook, and mentally rehearsing every possible outcome, because this hidden location presented challenges unlike anything I had faced: obstructions, shadows, multiple escape routes, and unpredictable behavior from the people involved, all under the watchful orchestration of a man whose reach seemed limitless, and distress, fear, and anticipation built into a near physical tension that made my muscles ache, my hands tremble, and my mind spin with both focus and terror. As the sequence unfolded, a young woman appeared, moving cautiously, glancing over her shoulder, unaware of the orchestrator's presence, and I felt my chest tighten, knowing that she was central to the scenario. That my observations and guidance could determine whether she remained safe or became a victim. And every movement, every whisper, every calculation became a matter of life or death. And yet, the psychological strain of being both observer and participant was almost overwhelming, 'cause I could feel his presence, his anticipation, his manipulation, radiating through the sequence, and I understood that this hidden location was a trap designed not only to challenge my skills, but to test my mental endurance, pushing me to the absolute limit of fear, focus, and courage. Finally, as the climax of the sequence approached, I saw the orchestrator himself move into position, deliberate, patient, calculating every step. I felt a surge of terror unlike anything before, because he was operating in the same space, unseen, manipulating events in real time, and the pressure to act correctly, anticipate accurately, and guide the potential victim safely became almost unbearable. Yet I forced myself to focus, spraying instructions, mapping movements, and mentally rehearsing interventions, knowing that the success of this sequence relied entirely on my ability to maintain clarity under extreme duress. Just as the figure approached a point of potential confrontation, the distant sound of sirens and flashing headlights announced the arrival of police, disrupting the sequence, and the orchestrator hesitated, shadows obscuring his movements, while the young woman remained unharmed but visibly shaken. And I felt a brief surge of relief, though my body was still coiled with tension, because while the immediate danger had been averted, the psychological impact, the knowledge of his reach, and the certainty that he would continue, escalate, and challenge me further, left me exhausted, terrified, and hyper-aware, fully cognizant that my life was irrevocably entwined with his sequences, each more complex, psychologically demanding, and dangerous than the last. I returned home in the early morning hours, rain dripping from the eaves, streets glistening under dim streetlights, notebook clutched tightly, flashlight low, body trembling. And I understood with chilling clarity that this hidden location had been more than attested, had been a demonstration of his capabilities, his reach, and his psychological control. And that from this point forward, every call, every sequence, every subtle cue would continue to test my endurance, observation, skills, courage, and ability to act under pressure, because failure was no longer just a possibility, was a certainty if I allowed fear, exhaustion, or distraction to undermine my focus. And I realized that I had entered a reality from which there was no escape, a world in which vigilance, precision, and psychological resilience were the only defenses against a man whose manipulation, patience, and cruelty knew no bounds, and whose next move could arrive at any moment, demanding my full attention, my complete participation, and my unwavering resolve. After the hidden location sequence, the pervasive tension that had been a constant in my life evolved into something more sinister, something I could no longer define simply as fear, because the knowledge that the man on the phone had demonstrated, his ability to manipulate not only events but the spaces I thought were safe my apartment, the streets I walked, in the previously hidden locations, made me realize that the next phase of his game would likely involve direct observation of my movements outside the carefully choreographed sequences. The psychological pressure that accompanied this realization was suffocating, pressing on my chest, making each breath deliberate, each glance over my shoulder a potential trigger, because I had no way of knowing if the shadow I glimpsed, the figure across the street, or the movement in the corner of my vision was real, or a product of my fear. Yet instinctively, I felt that the stalking was real, that he was now watching me continuously, tracking my habits, studying my routines, and calculating the next sequence in advance. And the idea that my life had become a continuous, unrelenting puzzle orchestrated by a predator with almost infinite patience and foresight left me both terrified and obsessively alert. The days blurred into nights as I moved through my routine with heightened vigilance, checking doors, windows, and any possible point of entry multiple times, altering my paths to and from work, grocery stores, and appointments, constantly aware of potential surveillance, the mental exhaustion piling atop physical fatigue, and yet the pattern was undeniable. At almost every turn, subtle cues emerged: shadow crossing a window, a parked car in the same location for hours, a figure lingering at a distance, always just beyond immediate recognition, that confirmed what my instincts had already been screaming, that I was being followed, that the sequences had escalated from cryptic instructions and remote observation into full-scale stalking, and that this shadow, this unseen orchestrator, had transformed the city around me into a psychological labyrinth where every decision, every movement, every breath could trigger the next phase of his manipulation. One evening, while returning home late from a long night of reviewing patterns and attempting to predict the next sequence, I noticed a figure across the street, partially obscured by the fog and dim street lights, and my body froze, heart hammering, breath catching, because the movements were deliberate. The figure pacing in a way that suggested patient calculation. And for the first time, I realized the stalking was no longer just observation, but a form of intimidation, a test of my nerves, my patience, and my ability to remain calm under pressure. And I felt a surge of anger, fear, and helplessness all at once, knowing that the orchestrator had inserted himself into my life in a way that could not be avoided, that my every action was now a variable in his calculations, and that no space, no path, no movement would be free from the weight of his presence. Over the following days, I meticulously tracked the pattern, noting each sighting, each subtle movement, each moment when the shadow seemed to anticipate my decisions. And the data revealed an almost supernatural level of foresight, because the figure's placement often corresponded exactly with the paths I had calculated to be least predictable, suggesting that he was not merely observing, but predicting, adapting, and constantly refining his manipulation. And the realization that I had become part of a living, evolving experiment filled me with terror, yet also with a grim determination to understand, anticipate, and survive, because any lapse could be fatal. I began documenting every detail obsessively, creating charts, maps, and sequences of movement, teeing the time, lighting, weather conditions, and the approximate distance and positioning of the shadow, all while attempting to sleep, eat, and maintain some semblance of normalcy. And the cumulative stress began to manifest physically: hands trembling, muscles aching, eyes strained, stomach constantly tight, but I knew that this level of focus was essential if I was to anticipate his next moves, intercept sequences before they escalated, and protect potential victims from harm, because in every previous scenario, those who failed to observe, calculate, and intervene had suffered consequences, and I had no intention of being one of them. One particularly foggy night, I followed the figure discreetly, weaving through alleyways, side streets, and abandoned lots, flashlight low, notebook clutched, heart pounding, every nerve alert, and I noticed for the first time subtle behaviors that hinted at his intent beyond simple observation. He paused at specific points, looked in multiple directions as though calculating escape routes, occasionally adjusted his positioning in response to my own movements. And I realized with a sickening clarity that he was orchestrating the city itself as a stage, manipulating shadows, sightlines, and potential witnesses in real time, creating a dynamic, living sequence designed to push me to my limits, to test my endurance, perception, and decision-making, and to ensure that every choice I made would have a direct impact on the unfolding events. The stalking continued night after night, each occurrence more psychologically taxing than the last, because I began to notice patterns, not just in his movements, but in the locations he selected, the places I frequented, the streets I walked, the stores I entered. All became potential sequences in a larger game, and the realization that he had a level of access and foresight that allowed him to manipulate events in real time without ever making direct contact filled me with both awe and terror. Because the sophistication of his observation, the precision of his sequences, and the relentless psychological pressure made it clear that this was more than a game. It was an elaborate, sadistic test designed to break me, to bend me, and yet, despite the terror, I felt compelled to continue, because I had become entangled in a scenario where my participation was unavoidable, where observation, calculation, and intervention were the only tools at my disposal, and failure was not an option, for both myself and for any potential victims whose fates had been intertwined with these sequences. Eventually, I realized that the stalking shadow was preparing the next sequence, one that would demand not just observation, but active guidance. And the subtle cues, the way the figure moved, the locations chosen, the timing of each appearance suggested a sequence more complex and dangerous than any before, involving multiple individuals, environmental hazards, and precise timing that would test every skill I had honed over weeks of relentless sequences, calls, and interventions. And I knew that the success of the upcoming scenario would depend entirely on my ability to remain calm, focused, and precise under pressure, simultaneously anticipating the orchestrator's calculations and adapting to the unpredictable behaviors of those unwittingly involved. On the night of the anticipated sequence, I prepared meticulously, reviewing maps, planning escape routes, plotting observation points, and coordinating with law enforcement as subtly as possible, while simultaneously preparing for contingencies, knowing that this stalking shadow could intervene in any number of unpredictable ways, and that the entire sequence could pivot in an instant, transforming from observation to immediate danger, and that my capacity to maintain control of the situation depended entirely on anticipation, calculation, and composure under extreme stress. As I moved through the city, following subtle cues, tracking the shadows' positioning, whispering directions, observing, calculating, and anticipating, I felt a profound mix of fear, focus, and determination, because I knew that this sequence represented the culmination of the stalking phase, a direct, psychologically immersive challenge that would push me to the brink, test my endurance, and demand that I apply every lesson, every observation, every calculation I had learned through the previous sequences, while simultaneously navigating an environment designed to obscure, confuse, manipulate both my perceptions and the outcomes for potential victims. And I realized that this confrontation with the stalking shadow was a turning point, one that would define not only the immediate events, but my ongoing ability to survive, anticipate, and protect those caught in the orchestrator's sequences. Because the stakes had never been higher, the complexity had never been greater, and the psychological pressure had never been more intense, leaving me fully aware that every movement, every decision, every observation would carry consequences that could be irreversible, and that my life and the lives of others depended entirely on my ability to act with precision, courage, and clarity in a scenario designed to overwhelm, terrify, and manipulate, leaving no room for error, no margin for miscalculation, and no escape from the relentless, stalking shadow that had become the defining force of my existence. The days following the stalking shadow sequence were a blur of exhaustion, decisive preparation, because I had come to realize that the orchestrator had been escalating steadily, testing not only my observation skills, but my endurance, my mental clarity, and my ability to respond under extreme psychological pressure, and now sensed with a cold certainty that the next sequence would be the culmination of everything he had been building toward, a final, intricate, and terrifying orchestration designed to push me to the absolute limit and possibly beyond, in the knowledge that I could not predict exactly where, when, or how it would unfold, combined with the understanding that the consequences of failure could be catastrophic, made every waking moment a tense balance between planning, anticipation, and fear, because I knew that unlike previous sequences, this one would not allow for error, delay, or hesitation, and that my ability to think clearly, act decisively, and anticipate his calculations would be the only things standing between safety and disaster. In the hours leading up to what I instinctively knew would be the final sequence, I reviewed every detail I had ever recorded: the patterns of his calls, the timing of previous sequences, the behavior of victims, the subtle environmental cues, the shadows, the noises, the locations he had selected, and meticulously cross-referenced everything, trying to build a mental model of how he operated, what he considered important, and how he might attempt to manipulate events in real time, because over weeks of observation and intervention, Okay? I had come to understand that his methods were precise, cold, and calculated, okay? And that he approached each sequence like a chess grandmaster, always several moves ahead, constantly refining his strategy. And now, I would be forced to match that precision under the most extreme stress I had ever experienced. Late that night, the blocked number call arrived, the familiar, deliberate tone filling my ears. And he spoke in fragments, almost conversational, almost casual, but with an undercurrent of menace that sent a shiver down my spine, saying, "Everything you have learned, every observation, every calculation, every instinct will be tested tonight. Watch closely, protect, record, decide." And I felt my pulse spike, my hands trembling as I scribbled every word in my notebook, aware that these instructions were both a warning and a challenge. A psychological setup meant to force me into a heightened state of alert, and a reminder that the final sequence would demand everything I had learned, every skill I had developed, and every ounce of mental and physical endurance I possessed. I left my apartment with flashlight in hand, notebook clutched, heart hammering, and moved through the streets with caution, hyper-aware of every sound, shadow, and movement. And I noticed subtle cues that he had embedded into the environment, flickering lights, patterns of debris, positions of parked cars that indicated the beginning of the sequence. Each detail meticulously calculated to guide me, test me, and pressure me simultaneously, and the realization that he had prepared this in advance, anticipating my thought processes, my responses, and my interpretations, left me simultaneously awed, terrified, and intensely focused, because I understood that the only way to survive and succeed was to match his precision, maintain absolute composure, and act decisively under extreme duress. The sequence led me through abandoned alleys, deserted lots, and dimly lit streets, each location chosen for its ability to obscure observation, manipulate perception, and challenge my ability to anticipate and act. And the complexity of the path, combined with the environmental hazards, shadows, and potential witnesses, created an almost unbearable psychological tension, because I had to constantly calculate every step, every angle, every timing, while simultaneously maintaining awareness of potential victims and coordinating with law enforcement as subtly as possible, knowing that a single miscalculation could have devastating consequences, and that failure was not an option. Hours passed as I followed the orchestrator's instructions, serving multiple figures, moving with deliberate precision, each action carefully choreographed, and I realized that this final sequence involved more variables than any previous scenario, including multiple potential victims, environmental hazards, shadowed observation points, and the orchestrator himself moving within the space, unseen but calculating every movement, every response, every potential outcome, and the psychological pressure of being both observer and participant. Knowing that the consequences of failure could be catastrophic pushed me to the very edge of fear, endurance, and focus. At one point, a young man and woman appeared, unaware of the orchestrator's presence, moving cautiously through the sequence's designated area, and I realized with sinking dread that my responsibility to guide, protect, and anticipate their actions was absolute, that the orchestrator had created a dynamic, evolving scenario where my observations, calculations, and interventions would directly determine whether they remained safe, and that every decision, every instruction, every observation would have immediate, tangible consequences, heightening the intensity, the pressure, and the stakes to almost unbearable levels. As I tracked their movements, whispering instructions to law enforcement, mapping paths, timing movements, and anticipating the orchestrator's interventions, I felt a profound psychological strain, a tension in every muscle, a constant hum of adrenaline and fear running through my body. And yet, I forced myself to remain calm, focused, and precise, because I understood that panic, hesitation, or distraction could compromise the entire sequence, endangering both the unwitting participants and myself, and that the orchestrator's intention was precisely to create that pressure, to test my limits, to force mistakes under extreme stress, and to determine whether I could rise to the challenge. The orchestrator moved unseen, deliberate, calculating, subtly manipulating environmental cues, shadows, and timings. And I realized with chilling clarity that he was treating the city, the people, and myself as pieces in a complex, living chessboard, with every detail designed to maximize stress, uncertainty, and psychological pressure. And that my only defense was careful observation, precise calculation, and unwavering focus, because the consequences of error could not be undone, and every second mattered. The sequence continued for hours, the young man and woman moving cautiously under my whispered guidance, shadows shifting, environmental hazards appearing and receding, and the orchestrator's presence felt everywhere despite his invisibility. Every subtle cue a reminder that he was in complete control of the scenario, manipulating events, timing, and perception in ways that tested my endurance, my focus, and my ability to act decisively under extreme pressure. And yet, I forced myself to continue because my involvement was the only thing standing between safety and disaster, and I could not allow fear, exhaustion, or hesitation to dictate the outcome. Finally, as the sequence approached its climax, the orchestrator made a move, a subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment in the environment, and I realized that this was the final test, the moment when every skill, every observation, every calculation would be challenged, and I felt my chest tighten, hands trembling, mind racing through every possible scenario, every contingency, every angle. As I guided the participants through the remaining obstacles, whispered directions to law enforcement, and mapped the orchestrator's likely next moves, knowing that success depended entirely on precision, clarity, and calm under the most extreme psychological pressure. Just as the orchestrator reached the point of direct intervention, distant sirens, flashing headlights, and law enforcement presence disrupted his plans. The participants remained unharmed but visibly shaken, and I felt a mixture of relief, terror, and exhaustion wash over me. Because while the immediate danger had been averted, the psychological impact, the knowledge of his reach, and the certainty that he had orchestrated an experience designed to push me to my limits left me drained, shaken, and fully aware that my life had been irrevocably entwined with his sequences, each more complex, psychologically demanding, dangerous than the last. As I returned home in the early hours, rain dripping from the eaves, streets glistening under the faint light of street lamps, notebook clutched tightly, flashlight low, body trembling, mind spinning, I realized with chilling clarity that the final sequence, or at least this phase of it, had demonstrated the orchestrator's full capability, the reach, the observation, the psychological manipulation, and the meticulous planning that had transformed every space, every environment, and every potential interaction into a test of endurance, focus, and courage, and that from this point forward, my life would be defined not only by vigilance, serve, and calculation, but by the constant awareness that the orchestrator could appear anywhere, manipulate any scenario, and continue to challenge me, push me, and test my limits in ways I could not yet fully comprehend, leaving me trapped in a reality where precision, courage, and psychological resilience were the only defenses against a predator whose cruelty, patience, and reach knew no bounds, and whose next sequence, whenever it came, would demand everything I had learned, everything I could endure, and everything I had yet to discover about both him and myself. After the culmination of the final sequence, the terror that had been a constant undercurrent in my life for weeks transformed into something even more tangible, more immediate, because I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that the orchestrator was not content merely to manipulate, observe, and test from a distance, but that he had escalated to a point where direct confrontation, psychological pressure, and the potential for immediate danger were inevitable, okay? And the knowledge that I could not avoid this confrontation, that it was coming whether I was prepared or not, filled me with a mixture of dread, determination, and almost surreal anticipation, because I understood that my survival, my ability to protect those caught in his sequences, and even my sanity depended entirely on my performance, my observation, my courage, and my capacity to act decisively under pressure. The days leading up to the confrontation were a blur of preparation, planning, and relentless observation, because I knew he would use every advantage, every subtle environmental cue, every psychological trick he had mastered over weeks of sequences, and I needed to anticipate, counter, and survive. And so I reviewed every note I had taken, every pattern one had observed, every previous sequence, every behavior, and meticulously cross-referenced them to attempt to construct a model of how he operated, how he thought, and what he might do when directly confronted, because I knew that knowledge would be the difference between life and death, between success and failure, and between maintaining some measure of control or succumbing completely to the fear and chaos he orchestrated. The night finally arrived, heavy with fog and rain, streets slick and reflective, shadows stretching long and dark across abandoned lots and alleyways. And I moved with calculated caution, notebook clutched, flashlight low, senses hyper-aware, every sound, shadow, and movement analyzed for potential cues, every instinct screaming that he could appear at any moment, okay? And that the confrontation could happen at the slightest provocation, because the orchestrator had a way of forcing events to his design, ensuring that his sequences maintained maximum psychological pressure and control. And I understood that the confrontation would not simply be a physical encounter, but a mental, emotional, and psychological test designed to push me to my absolute limits. As I navigated the predetermined path of the sequence, I began to notice subtle cues that indicated his presence, flickering streetlights timed almost perfectly with my movements, shadows shifting in patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation, distant sounds that were slightly off kilter, but precise enough to guide or test me. And I realized with a chill that he was already orchestrating the confrontation, using the environment itself as a tool, and I had to rely on my observation, reasoning, and calm under pressure to navigate the scenario successfully. Eventually, I arrived at a derelict warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, a location that immediately struck me as the orchestrator's chosen stage for the confrontation, because it offered multiple points of observation, limited visibility, environmental hazards, and shadows perfect for concealment. And as I paused outside the building, notebook open, flashlight low, I felt a surge of fear and adrenaline, because I knew that the orchestrator was inside, likely aware of my arrival, and fully prepared to manipulate the space, the timing, and my responses to create maximum tension, test my nerves, and push me to my limits. I took a deep breath, forcing my body to remain calm despite the pounding of my heart, the trembling of my hands, and the adrenaline flooding through my veins. And I carefully entered the warehouse, scanning the shadows, noting the layout, and mentally rehearsing possible outcomes, because every step, every movement, every observation could dictate the success or failure of this confrontation, and I could not afford a single misstep, hesitation, or lapse in focus, because the orchestrator's sequences had already demonstrated the lethal consequences of error. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, dampness, taint, and the faint metallic smell of rusted machinery, and I moved slowly, flashlight illuminating piles of debris, broken equipment, and darkened corners, noting the subtle signs he had left: footprints, disturbed dust, faint reflections, and the slight movement of shadows that suggested he was observing, calculating, waiting for the precise moment to escalate the confrontation. and I realized that the entire warehouse had been transformed into a stage. Each element deliberately positioned, manipulated, and timed to create maximum psychological pressure, to force mistakes, and to test my endurance, composure, and capacity to act decisively under extreme duress. I progressed cautiously, every muscle coiled, every nerve alert, noting the shadows and angles, the potential obstacles, the pathways, and potential hiding spots, while continuously cross-referencing my observations with previous patterns, because I understood that his orchestration relied not on physical brute force, but on precise timing, manipulation, and psychological dominance, and that success depended entirely on anticipating his moves, countering his manipulations, and maintaining clarity under fear and uncertainty, because any lapse could give him the advantage and potentially endanger both myself and any unwitting participants caught in the sequence. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, I finally perceived subtle movement in the shadows, a shift in angle, a disturbance in the dust, the faintest echo of a step, and I realized that the orchestrator had made his presence known, not with a direct confrontation, but with a carefully calculated signal, a test of my perception, focus, and ability to interpret subtle cues under extreme psychological pressure. And I felt a surge of both fear and resolve, because this was the point where all my preparation, observation, and experience would be tested simultaneously, and the outcome would depend entirely on my ability to remain calm, focused, and decisive. As I followed the subtle cues, navigating through the shadows, I noticed the orchestrator's careful manipulation of space, the placement of debris to channel movement, subtle light and shadow contrasts to obscure or reveal paths, environmental cues to manipulate perception and timing, and I realized with chilling clarity that he had anticipated my every action, every likely movement, every calculation, and had prepared contingencies for multiple outcomes, ensuring that the confrontation would be both psychologically immersive and extremely dangerous. And I understood that my ability to observe, reason, and act decisively would determine the success or failure of this final confrontation. The tension was almost unbearable as I closed in on the orchestrator's position. Every shadow a potential threat, every sound a signal, every movement an opportunity or a trap. And I felt the psychological pressure mounting, my senses heightened to a level that was almost painful. Yet I forced myself to remain calm, deliberate, and precise, because I knew that panic, hesitation, or distraction could compromise the entire sequence, endanger potential victims, and leave me vulnerable to the orchestrator's manipulations. Finally, I perceived him not fully, but enough to understand his presence, a figure partially obscured by shadows, deliberate, patient, calculating every movement. And I realized with a chilling certainty that this was the culmination of weeks, of sequences, the apex of his orchestration, and the ultimate test of my endurance, observation, and psychological resilience, because in this moment, everything I had learned, every pattern, every observation, every skill would be tested simultaneously. The outcome would depend entirely on my ability to remain focused, anticipate his moves, and act decisively under extreme stress. For what felt like an eternity, we moved in a careful, tense dance, each step, shadow, and movement calculated. As I navigated the warehouse, whispered directions to law enforcement, observed environmental cues, tracked his subtle manipulations, and maintained psychological control under immense pressure. And I realized that the confrontation was as much a mental and emotional battle as it was a physical one, a test of endurance, clarity, and courage, because the orchestrator sequences had always relied on psychological dominance, manipulation, and precise orchestration to achieve his goals. And now, at last, I was fully immersed in the ultimate scenario, where success, survival, and the protection of others depended entirely on my ability to anticipate, observe, and act with unwavering precision, focus, and courage under pressure. And in that tense, shadow-filled space, I understood with a mixture of fear, determination, and grim satisfaction that this confrontation, while terrifying, represented the culmination of my journey through the sequences, the stalking, and the hidden locations, a moment where my endurance, observation, courage, and clarity under extreme psychological pressure would finally be tested, and that whatever happened next would define not only the immediate outcome of this orchestrated scenario, but my ongoing capacity to survive, protect, and navigate the terrifying, intricate world the orchestrator had created. A world in which vigilance, precision, and psychological resilience were the only defenses against a predator whose patience, cruelty, and manipulative genius knew no bounds, and whose sequences could continue indefinitely, demanding everything I had learned, every skill I had developed, and every ounce of courage and focus I possessed. The tension that had been building for weeks, months even, reached a level that felt almost unbearable as I stood within the shadow-filled warehouse. Every sense stretched, taut, every nerve screaming, every muscle coiled like a spring, because I knew in that moment that the orchestrator, the man who had transformed my life into a labyrinth of sequences, stalking, hidden locations, and psychological manipulation, had brought me here for the ultimate endgame. It's a final sequence that would test everything I had learned, everything I had endured, everything I had survived, and that the lives of others, the potential victims, and my own safety now depended entirely on my ability to observe, calculate, anticipate, pay, and act with flawless precision under the most extreme psychological pressure I had ever faced. And the realization that this was the culmination of his carefully orchestrated plan made my heart pound, my hands tremble, and my mind race through every possible contingency, every potential outcome, every escape route, and every intervention. Because any mistake, hesitation, or lapse in judgment could have catastrophic consequences. And I could feel the orchestrator's presence everywhere, though unseen, manipulating shadows, timing, environmental cues, and my own perceptions. Master of psychological warfare who had turned the city, the streets, the buildings, and even the darkness itself into a stage for his meticulously calculated sequences. I moved slowly, deliberately, flashlight low, notebook clutched, eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, every subtle movement, listening for the faintest noises, interpreting the subtlest cues. Because I had learned that he used even the smallest environmental detail to manipulate events, create pressure, and test my endurance and observational skills. And I realized with a sickening clarity that the warehouse itself had been transformed into a living puzzle, a labyrinth designed to challenge not only my physical movements, but my psychological resilience, my ability to stay calm under extreme stress, and my capacity to make rapid, accurate decisions while the orchestrator manipulated events around me like a chess master moving pieces on a board, calculating multiple moves ahead, anticipating my responses, and setting traps for both myself and the unwitting participants whose lives were entwined in this sequence. As I navigated deeper into the warehouse, I observed faint movements, shadows shifting, debris slightly displaced, tidal changes in lighting and reflections. I recognized the hallmarks of his manipulation. It's a deliberate orchestration that forced me to anticipate, calculate, and adapt constantly. And I felt a mixture of fear, determination, and grim focus, because I knew that maintaining composure, clarity, and precision in this high-stakes environment was the only way to ensure survival and protect others, and that every second counted, every observation mattered, and every decision could have life or death consequences. At one point, I noticed two figures, a man and a woman, moving cautiously through the shadows. Unaware of the orchestrator's presence, but clearly central to the sequence, and I felt my chest tighten. Heart hammering, because guiding them safely through the orchestrated sequence depended entirely on my ability to anticipate environmental cues, predict the orchestrator's manipulations, and communicate instructions clearly and silently, simultaneously observing and reacting to every movement, sound, and shadow. And I realized that this was not merely a test of endurance or observation, but a full-scale, psychological, strategic, and emotional challenge designed to push me to the absolute limits of human capacity, forcing me to rely on every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage I possessed. For hours, I moved through the warehouse, shadow by shadow, step by step, guiding the participants, whispering directions to law enforcement, calculating timing, anticipating the orchestrator's interventions, and mentally rehearsing contingencies, because I understood that failure at any point could be catastrophic, that the orchestrator's sequences had been carefully designed to exploit even the smallest mistake, hesitation, or lapse in focus, and that my survival, the safety of the participants, and the resolution of the entire endgame depended entirely on my ability to remain calm, focused, and precise under the most extreme psychological stress I had ever experienced. And yet, despite the fear, exhaustion, and constant tension, I felt an intense clarity, an almost surreal focus, because in that moment, everything I had learned, every pattern I had observed, every sequence I had survived, and every skill I had developed was being tested and applied simultaneously. It's creating a sense of purpose and urgency that overrode the panic threatening to overwhelm me. As the sequence progressed, the orchestrator made subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments. Shadows shifted, debris repositioned, timing of movements altered, environmental cues subtly changed, and I realized with a chilling certainty that he was actively testing my ability to adapt in real time, to recognize manipulation, and to maintain control in a scenario designed to overwhelm both physically and psychologically. And I understood that the final confrontation was not about physical dominance, but about mental acuity, observation, and endurance under pressure, because the orchestrator had transformed the environment itself into a test of human limits, and I was the subject. Eventually, I reached the central space of the warehouse, where the orchestrator's presence became more tangible, the shadows deeper, the environmental manipulation more precise, and I could feel the weight of his calculations pressing on me, a suffocating awareness that he had anticipated every potential move, that every path, shadow, and reflection had been designed to test, pressure, and manipulate me, and that the end game was now fully underway. A culmination of all previous sequences, orchestrations, and manipulations, and the final, ultimate test of my endurance, skill, and psychological resilience. The young man and woman were nearby, guided carefully under my observation, and the orchestrator's presence remained unseen but palpable, a constant pressure, a shadow that influenced every decision, every movement, and every calculation. And I realized that the final sequence was as much a psychological and strategic battle as it was a physical one, because my ability to remain calm, precise, and observant determined not only their safety, but also the conclusion of this end game, the resolution of the sequences, and my own survival. And I felt a profound mixture of fear, determination, and clarity as I moved, calculated, guided, and observed, knowing that every second, every action, and every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. At the climax of the sequence, the orchestrator's manipulations intensified. Environmental cues became more subtle and complex. Shadows shifted in near-perfect coordination with my movements, and I understood that the ultimate test was now mine. Endurance, observation, anticipation, and ability to act decisively under extreme psychological pressure were being tested simultaneously, and the stakes could not have been higher, because any mistake could lead to harm for the participants, my own endangerment, or complete failure of the end game. And I forced myself to remain calm, precise, and unwavering, applying everything I had learned, every skill I had honed, every observation and pattern I had recorded, to guide the participants safely, anticipate the orchestrator's moves, navigate the complex, manipulated environment with maximum accuracy, because in that moment, survival and resolution depended entirely on my capacity to function under pressure and maintain control. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the orchestrator's presence began to recede. Subtle cues diminished, shadows stabilized, and the sequence reached its resolution. The young man and woman, unharmed, guided safely out of the manipulated environment, and I felt an overwhelming wave of relief, exhaustion, and lingering terror. Because while the immediate threat had passed, the psychological impact, the knowledge of the orchestrator's capabilities, and the intensity of the end game left me shaken, drained, and profoundly aware of the fragile balance between control, observation, and chaos in his sequences. And I realized that the final chapter of this ordeal, while completed, had fundamentally changed me, leaving an indelible mark on my psyche, my approach to observation, and my understanding of fear, endurance, and the intricate dance of psychological manipulation that had defined the orchestrator's sequences from the very beginning. As I returned home in the early dawn, rain-slicked streets reflecting faint light, notebook clutched, flashlight low, body trembling, mind spinning, I knew with a mixture of terror, relief, and cautious reflection that the orchestrator's sequences had concluded, at least for now, that I had survived, and that the participants were safe, but also that the experience had left a permanent imprint on my life. My perception of danger and my understanding of human psychology, endurance, and the terrifying potential for manipulation, calculation, and control that one individual could exert over others, and I understood that while the immediate sequences had ended, the lessons, the scars, and the awareness of the orchestrator's capabilities would remain with me forever, a chilling reminder of the thin line between observation, manipulation, and survival, and the unrelenting complexity, danger, and psychological mastery that defined the world he had created. A world in which vigilance, precision, courage, and psychological resilience were the only defenses against a predator whose patience, cruelty, and orchestrated sequences were nearly limitless.